systems in the US debate on
映画
healthcare,
あの人はね
except when somebody is making a completely
こういうことや
caricatured
ったか
analysis of the way, say,
これ
Canada
100均で買
does
ったんや
things.
な
So I think part of what we need to do is stress the need to look at best practice so that politicians and voters become more aware that there are solutions to most of the public policy problems. We just haven't tried them in many
コンビ
countries.
ニがよった
On the other hand, I think there's one other side to this that one shouldn't forget. Sometimes you'll meet people who'll tell you, well, the Scandinavians have worked everything out, and Sweden or Finland or Denmark has come up with the perfect solution to policy problems. That's often an argument people make on the left in the United States. But I don't think the solutions that the Swedes came up with in recent decades necessarily would work in a country as large and as diverse as the United States. So let's look at best practice. Let's understand which systems deliver the best results. But let's not pretend that one size is going to fit all. Part of the reason for the success of Western civilization, which is where democracy began, was the diversity of systems and the competition between them.
私も香港でアメリカに
I recently read that information is now the world's most consequential and contested geopolitical resource. I think that's right. Global internet penetration has revolutionized the information domain, and information operations, which aren't new, are dramatically expanding in scale and scope. This is a new challenge for media organizations, which are already facing a business model crisis and declining trust. Meanwhile, AI advances confer strategic advantage to those with access to lots of data. This has implications for privacy, but also for the information advantage that democracies have traditionally enjoyed.
Well, does diplomacy, European diplomacy exist? It's not an easy question, and the answer is yes and no. Yes, in an institutional sense, that is, Mrs. Mogherini today exists. She travels, she can deliver some messages for Europe, but I would say certainly not on the most fundamental issues of foreign policy, because members of the European Union are many of those nation states. They have their own foreign policy, security apparatus and so forth and so on. And I cannot imagine the French diplomacy just to be European diplomacy, and the same with the UK, as long as the UK is in the EU, or German diplomacy, they could continue the list. So, in my judgment, the best merit of the EU diplomacy is first to perhaps reduce as much as possible the differences between various diplomacies of the member states. As such, it's not so bad. And also, I think diplomacy can with some relatively secondary issues, such as, for instance, I'm thinking of Timor case in Indonesia, that is issues which are not at the forefront of national diplomacies, but which nevertheless can have some importance. So, to conclude, I would say that the real European diplomacy will exist only the day when the Europeans have a clear understanding of what they want to achieve, what is the identity of the European Union still to be built, because diplomacy, like defense, has to do with protecting the identity of the political unit. And I think we are not yet the stage when we are able to answer this question. What is
意外といろんな勢力が入ってきますね。どうっていいですやっぱね、ずっと前からやっぱりどうああ、支部とか本部だし、ここ多分嘘だろ。
Certainly similarly in one respect that Thucydides wrote about brilliantly in his book on the Peloponnesian War. That when a rising war, as Thucydides wrote about Athens,
やばいね。ダメやったか。ハーバード大学の
they're certainly similar in one respect that Thucydides wrote about brilliantly in his book on the Peloponnesian War.
だろうな、サーリーズ、お前よりひで、2008年、やったやろ、高津君。元職員、やったやろ、お前。お前やろ、俺そっちの。お前か、これ。俺のか、お前さ、インスタグラム見たけど、お前サーリーセブンと。ないな、ないな。こう書いて、よ。東映に苦情が殺到して引きはちょっと違うさ。
I think China's rise will change the international configuration from the unipolar to a bipolar, and also possibly and make the world order
これは
different from
池田部と
But it
久保
doesn't
する
mean
の。
that the China's rise
ってい
is
う
the
か
only
なんで
factor
こうするの
to
ウィキ
change
ない
the
あ
order. And actually, the Trump administration's policy
これアス
is
カ
more
平
challenging
と久保
than China's rise to the current international order. Because China's policy try to maintain the order, the reason is very obvious. China benefit from the present order, and meanwhile, the Trump administration believes that China benefit more from the current order than the United States. That's why they want to change the order, and based on the ideology of anti-establishment, anti-establishmentism. So from my side, if we're talking about what the ideology
おいしゃれさいてるなこれ。
or the liberalist order is the anti-establishmentism in US and the populism in the world.
確かなんで英明店東京事務所おかしだあれ大使館みたいなのここのエールな見たことない中村時弘たちもしかしていいのかもたちもしかしてあの20年やばい三日月やがって出ろ本当にうどんメンツ赤澤さんだけすいませんたちも今別組織が国流会があるやっぱりなんかやすい人口たち
change, China will become the dominant power, not just economically, but politically. It's too soon to tell that, however, on that, because there are a lot of different variables. Will there be a direct conflict between China and the US? For example,
多分ね、西村倉庫は整備。
will China perhaps be constrained by other things? Maybe there'll be internal disruption to China's politics. If it cannot manage to, for example, maintain the current political stability, that could disrupt China's political rise. And finally, there's the question of the rest of the world, because between China and the US are not the whole world economy. Other major powers will have a say in this. And at the moment, it looks like most of the other major powers of the world, Japan and the European Union, are closer to the United States than to China. So there's a question whether China, even as the world's largest economy, can become the dominant political power without allies.
「再起動の意味が通りで」なんだって。
I think economic growth, the success or failure of it will be determined by the degree to which individual countries and regions can supply jobs for the great emerging middle classes of these countries, formerly poor countries. I think what we're likely to see in the 21st century is many people who are either liberated from hard labor or from whom there is too little hard labor to provide jobs. And what will these people do? How will they be employed? And I think that will be a major factor contributing forward. Also, even though the world population is declining, we're still in an era of massive male bulges in about 20 or 30 countries, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to provide jobs for people, whether it's in China, in Yemen, in Ethiopia, or wherever.
カザクスタン。やっぱりね、戦略研究所だった。いや、置いてるらしいな。まあ大体アメリカ戦略国際
if robotics and artificial intelligence and the upcoming industrial revolution are a threat or an opportunity for the world and for manufacturing countries and also for developing countries. And the answer is still unknown, but what is sure now is that we have to invest in the main assets that are characterizing the industrial revolution, the digital transformation, competences, infrastructures, data centers, and all the tools that are fundamental and are considered enabling technologies for the future digital transformation. I also presented the differences between the US, Europe, and China, how they are integrating artificial intelligence into different knowledge and competences and scientific results. For example, in the US, they are investing very much in developing artificial intelligence for humanities, while in China, they are investing in developing artificial intelligence for agricultural application, for producing food, for example. So globalization has obtained some results in terms of being socially connected, but in terms of geopolitics, we still see many differences also in how the digital transformation is implemented in the society. Then I spoke about robotics and how the journey of robotics is coming into us, because robotics was developed for manufacturing countries, for industrial production, and robots are in manufacturing plants. But in recent years, what we have seen is the development of service robotics, which is intended to support services and the offer of services in terms of medical robotics, social robotics, educational robotics. And now what is happening is that robotics is coming into our houses by producing some consumer products and also producing changes in the society in some of supporting autonomous drive or different products that are revolutionizing business and revolutionizing our life.
Very serious problem of people left behind. The global agenda talks about eradicating poverty, eradicating hunger, having every child in primary and secondary education. We're off track to achieve these things. And that means not just a few people left behind, it means literally hundreds of millions of people missing out. Take education, more than 250 million children, adolescents and youth not in school as we speak. How can those children and youth in the future really contribute to a knowledge economy if denied the most basic access to education? So it is time for the international community to get a grip on the reality of what is happening. If we want a world that is well fed, where people don't live in extreme poverty, where education is a right, not a privilege, we have a lot to do. International development assistance is important, critical for the lowest income countries. For other countries to be prioritising their budget so that their growth is inclusive and sustainable is critical. There are solutions. What's needed is the political will to activate and implement those solutions.
There are more than 70 million people in the world that are forcibly displaced from their homes, either as refugees crossing borders or displaced in their own country because of war, violence, discrimination, persecution, bad governance. Why is that? The world has become a difficult place where to make peace. We have become unable to make peace and to build peace. So that's the first thing that we need to look at if we want to reduce this global refugee crisis. Meanwhile, what is very important to remember is that 85% of those 70 million people are not in the rich world. They are in poor countries or middle-income countries. So the effort, and the new effort, not just humanitarian, but medium, long-term effort, founded on sound development, both for refugees and for host communities, has to focus on those countries. We have now a global compact on refugees. We will have the first ever global refugee forum in December this year in Geneva. These are opportunity to rally broader coalitions of actors, not just states and the United Nations, but also the private sector, the business community, civil society, academia, to forge new ways to respond to the global refugee crisis and to finally address strategically its root causes.
The question that you're raising, will Syria find a long-lasting peace? Well, the Syrian people deserve a long-lasting peace. Think about it. They've been 8 years now in a horrible conflict which became from local, regional, and frankly international. So the answer is it must be yes. Now, how to do it is where the challenge is coming. And the only way to do it is actually to end the military conflict, because because there is no solution. It's not just a word, it's the truth. There will never be just a military solution, and include everyone. New constitution, elections under UN supervision, that would be a way to include them.
So I'm Jane Harmon, and the question is, what is the future of political parties? I can speak to the U.S. more than anywhere else. I was a member of our Congress for 9 terms and left because it became so partisan.
Well, I'm delighted to be able tonight to address the members of the trilaterals and their guests, and I think my focus will be tonight on 3 things. One is, multilateralism has been the bread and butter of many of us, certainly at the IMF, and we believe that it has been critical in order to address many of the potential disorders of the world. Multilateralism is under threat at the moment, and I think that we have to make every effort to rejuvenate it, adapt it, and make sure that it continues to help govern particularly the economic developments around the world. That's message number 1. My second message will have to do with the much more longer term consequences of short-term policies and mechanisms, and that is really the consequences of climate change. I believe that many of the issues that we're debating at the moment will mean absolutely nothing in 20 years' time if we have not acted now in order to make sure that the planet remains something that is hospitable for our children and grandchildren. And my third message, which will not surprise any of those who know me or my friends, will have to do with inequality, and in particular the inequality that women have to suffer and have had to suffer for a long time. And while inequality as such is a major disruption, I believe that by addressing women's situation and the inequality that they face, it will help quite a way in reducing inequalities. So we'll try to do that tonight.
Became so partisan and dysfunctional. At the Wilson Center, we study this, and there are some remedies to the problems, but bottom line, in the U.S., our tradition is 2 parties only. In Europe, there are multi-party systems in most countries.
We're living through an era of rapid and disruptive change. That's across the board, economy, society, and what we're seeing is that nowhere is that disruption more evident than the trends associated with climate change. We're all familiar with the extreme events, the temperature rises, and the inexorable change that we're seeing to the planet's ecology as a result of climate change. But a major part of that discussion is how does energy transition and decarbonization of our energy system, which accounts for about 2/3 of carbon emissions, how will that impact climate change, and can we enter an energy transition era rapidly enough to mitigate carbon that will take us to a safe future? This is already happening. Renewable energy today is cost competitive on the grid. In a few years, renewable energy has reached 33% of capacity of global power generation. It's the fastest growing segment, and costs are decreasing rapidly. So what we're going to see is a rapid movement towards energy transition that's also going to be disruptive for the business models of today. It's going to imply new geostrategic relationships among countries as countries move away from resource-dependent fossil fuel-based systems into clean energy systems, and the resource is going to become technology, and technology innovation is going to decide the winners and losers in this race.
The low-carbon economy should come because to avoid the climate change, serious, effort is necessary. Many of the governments are trying the new technologies, new regulations, new rules to move to that direction. But the IEA, International Energy Agency, assessed the current effort is not enough. We need much more effort to introduce new technologies about renewables or carbon-related technologies, efficiency in a difficult sector, in the industry, and new regulations. So we need really double or triple our effort to make it happen. One of the areas which IEA focused on is hydrogen. Hydrogen can be used to store the electricity generated by wind or solar, which is very volatile, and storage is the key element. So battery may not necessarily be enough, so hydrogen can be used. And also hydrogen can be used for steel, cement, some of the industries where the decarbonization is very difficult. So that's another area. The third one will be the hydrogen could be the new transformation for the sectors of the oil or gas producing country. If they can remove carbon dioxide from oil or gas or coal, then these hydrocarbon change into the very friendly, climate-friendly resources. So this may prevent the hydrocarbon as a stranded asset. So maybe the hydrogen is one of the key area. We need lots of infrastructure building, technologies are necessary, but hydrogen may give us a good chance to achieve the sustainable future.
The challenge of dealing with a disinformation narrative is that it's not enough just to check the facts, because by definition, any disinformation narrative doesn't have good facts. They make their facts up. They're actually lying. This is why it's disinformation. So the challenge with disinformation actors is that the thing they have in common is they're really good storytellers. They tell a story that people want to believe. A lot of the time they will appeal to anger, they'll appeal to fear, they'll appeal to hatred, and they will try and stop people thinking. They'll try and get people so enraged that they switch off their critical faculty. That means that for those of us who are trying to challenge these narratives on a daily basis, it's a much more complex challenge than just presenting the facts. You have to have the ability to tell the story, and you have to find an emotion to appeal to, which will actually get people to think. Now, fortunately, there is a model of story which works. If you think of the detective story, that's a story where you're putting together evidence and you're telling people, this is what happened, this is why it happened. And it appeals to a different sort of emotion. It appeals to curiosity, it appeals to problem solving. And so a lot of the challenge of dealing with disinformation is presenting the story of how the disinformation was created, how was the trick done, and you can lead people on the story and you can show them, this person is telling you that here is a video of somebody attacking a voter at a polling station yesterday, but actually look, this video showed up on CNN 4 years ago in a different context. You can share that voyage of discovery with the person you're talking with, and then they will realize how the trick was done, but it will also sensitize them that the next time around, they'll be looking for that same trick. If you teach people very simple skills like searching for a photo online or searching for a video online, you can actually make them proof against that kind of reused content and repackaged content, not just today, but every time this kind of thing comes up. And so really dealing with disinformation, you have to have the facts, but you have to teach the skills as well. You have to give people the ability to solve the problems for themselves, because then you'll be appealing to their curiosity, you'll be appealing to their problem-solving senses, and you'll be appealing to their sense of pride in actually exposing the story in the first place. And those are the kind of emotions which will then counter the anger and the fear and the hatred that disinformation actors try to target.
Cities are one of the greatest innovations of all times, and what's interesting right now is that urbanization is, alongside with digitalization, a very, very strong economic force and force for innovation, as more and more people move into cities and metro areas. And urban areas were important during the industrial era, but they are increasingly important in a knowledge-based economy. And what's interesting, especially for a person like me who comes from a small city like Stockholm, is that there seems to be room for cities outside the megacities as well. There are some really interesting drivers of innovation that are smaller or mid-sized cities, amongst which Stockholm is actually one, but there are a number of examples. And what is important if a city wants to become an outlier or a hub for innovation is collaboration. If you look at urban innovation especially, you need to have strong public-private partnership. The mayor needs to gather people from private sector, from academia and other stakeholders around the table and work together to solve problems. And I think we see that to a quite large extent right now, and I hope we'll see more of it going forward.
So we had, I have to say, a global meeting with three North American, Asian Pacific and European members of the Trilateral Commission, which was very, very multidimensional, if I may. Multidimensional in the great tradition of the Trilateral Commission by the, I would say, experiences of the members, by the sensitivities of the members, by the fact that it was, of course, a non-partisan, multi-sensitivities meeting, also because the issues that we addressed were very, very multidimensional in all respect. We addressed issues that were of a geostrategic nature, issues that were of an economic nature, profoundly economic nature, issues that were related to environmental issues and difficulties and challenges. And we addressed also these particular challenges for our societies that populism, so-called populism, represent, which is also a largely multi-dimensional issue. So I think it was really trilateral at its best, and also it was the occasion to confirm some dimensions and orientations of the trilateral and to make new experience, to reinforce in a number of domains our, I would say, franchise as the Trilateral Commission. First, let me mention that the trilateral is called trilateral because there is not only the new hemisphere, the US, Mexico, Canada, but also Europe and also Asia. And of course, the whole of Asia at a global level is more and more important. As regards new dimension for the Trilateral Commission, not only we confirmed our own values, democratic values, rule of law, human rights, and all what goes with a democratic society, but we also reinforce and confirmed our values as regards multilateralism, international cooperation, in the best sense of the term. We also said that we would like to be more transparent than we were before at the level of the trilateral as a whole, with a new initiative that we took, in particular the idea of having the display of video to sum up some of the issues that we would have addressed, and also with the idea of making known at the level of the Trilateral Commission all publications, articles, interventions, books that would be displayed or published by the members of the Trilateral Commission. All this, of course, as part of transparency and also as part of being more influential if it is possible. We also have given a mandate to the three chairs to see in which direction we could be more proactive in terms of communication, display of our ideas through various forms. So this is is something which we consider very important and is one of the major conclusions of the Trilateral Commission which took place in Paris.
Sullivan. I am the new chair of the North America group of the Trilateral Commission. I wanted to take this opportunity to say a few words about the Commission and about our future. As you may know, the Trilateral Commission is a storied institution, an organization with 46 years of history of having an impact on big ideas, on bringing people together across different sectors and across 3 different geographies, that of North America, Europe, and Asia. But we are on the cusp of a new chapter, one that builds on that history, but really reorients ourselves and puts us in a position to make an impact in a very, very different world. And the reason why I have such confidence that the Commission can remake itself is because there is a need, and the Commission is well suited to meet that need. And that need is quite simply that in this day and age, in these political landscapes, the need is simply for more organizations, more individuals, more entities to take up the mantle of defending a rules-based order, an order that values and is committed to democratic principles, ideas like free trade and human rights. And we also have a need for more ideas to help us tackle new challenges, or certainly challenges that are new to this generation. And there are many reasons why I think the Trilateral Organization is so well poised to meet this need. First and foremost, we are an organization that at its heart is a community of countries that share a common set of values, that share these commitments to these ideas about democracy, about free markets, about the rule of law. And secondly, we have a membership that spans policy, business, and academia and media. And that allows us to bring minds together and experience to bear on problems that are no longer just the purview of one of those sectors. The things that need to be thought about today and where we need new solutions and prescriptions are ones that are at the intersection of business and policy, whether it is the contributions that private sector organizations can make to combating climate change, whether it is figuring out the ideas that will drive the reform of capitalism, or whether it is understanding the impact of technology on our systems. All of these things need business, government, and others at the table to help with. Now, of course, to realize this potential for the Trilateral Organization to meet this need, we are going to have to do some things differently than we have in the past. First and foremost, we are going to have to recognize, as a group primarily of democracies, we need to spend some time looking at ourselves, looking internally, saying what's happening with our own institutions, what is the health of our own institutions, and how is that situation affecting our ability to cooperate across national lines and deliver global problems to pressing global solutions. So we're spending more time talking about things like populism and the impact of technology on our own societies. Secondly, we've got to think about impact differently. Traditionally, we're an organization that has had impact based on the very nature of our relationships. We're an organization of people who have close ties to national governments, and often the ideas that we debate in private inform our own perspectives and inform our discussions and deliberations and conversations with people in positions of power. That will still be true, but today we need to think about having an impact on the broader debate. We no longer live in a world where governments are the only ones that can influence the future. In fact, increasingly, we have to think about other entities as being the real engines of change, and be that corporations or universities or even individuals. We need to think about how to shape the conversation, how to bring those groups in, to have investment in and commitment to solutions, and we need to move ahead whether or not we're able to get our governments to agree with our prescriptions and recommendations. So in short, it's a really exciting time to be part of the Trilateral Commission. I'm deeply honored to be the new chair of the North America Group, and I look forward to working with all our members members and my colleagues from other regions to realize this vision. Thank you.
So I'm Jane Harmon, and the question is, what is the future of political parties? I can speak to the U.S. more than anywhere else. I was a member of our Congress for 9 terms and left because it became so partisan and dysfunctional. At the Wilson Center, we study this, and there are some remedies to the problems. But bottom line, in the U.S., our tradition is 2 parties only. In Europe, there are multi-party systems in most countries, and we're seeing the rise of populist parties. In the U.S., we have no populist party. We have a Republican Party that is now dominated by our president, and we have a Democratic Party where most of the noise is coming from the far left. What we don't have is anything to represent the center, and that is the challenge for the U.S. going forward. That is something I work on, and that is something that the Wilson Center is hoping to improve, because if we are to convey at least a majority view in the United States, essential to making our foreign policy and domestic policy effective, we need to reach for the center so that we have both parties participating. And hopefully we'll advance that goal here at the Trilateral Commission. So I'm Jane Harmon, and the question is, what is the future of political parties? I can speak to the U.S. more than anywhere else. I was a member of our Congress for 9 terms and left because it became so partisan and dysfunctional. At the Wilson Center, we study this, and there are some remedies to the problems. But bottom line, in the U.S., our tradition is 2 parties only. In Europe, there are multi-party systems in most countries, and we're seeing the rise of populist parties. In the U.S., we have no populist party. We have a Republican Party that is now dominated by our president, and we have a Democratic Party where most of the noise is coming from the far left. What we don't have is anything to represent the center, and that is the challenge for the U.S. going forward. That is something I work on, and that is something that the Wilson Center is hoping to improve, because if we are to convey at least a majority view in the United States, essential to making our foreign policy and domestic policy effective, we need to reach for the center so that we have both parties participating. And hopefully we'll advance that goal here at the Trilateral Commission. So I'm Jane Harmon, and the question is, what is the future of political parties? I can speak to the U.S. more than anywhere else. I was a member of our Congress for 9 terms and left because it became so partisan and dysfunctional. At the Wilson Center, we study this, and there are some remedies to the problems. But bottom line, in the U.S., our tradition is 2 parties only. In Europe, there are multi-party systems in most countries, and we're seeing the rise of populist parties. In the U.S., we have no populist party. We have a Republican Party that is now dominated by our president, and we have a Democratic Party where most of the noise is coming from the far left. What we don't have is anything to represent the center, and that is the challenge for the U.S. going forward. That is something I work on, and that is something that the Wilson Center is hoping to improve, because if we are to convey at least a majority view in the United States, essential to making our foreign policy and domestic policy effective, we need to reach for the center so that we have both parties participating. And hopefully we'll advance that goal here at the Trilateral Commission.
legitimize the process of political competition, to mobilize the population for access to power. The first objective, the one of intermediation, has been badly eroded by technology, by the social media, because people have direct access to the politicians, to society in general, to make their demands directly to the people. However, nothing has replaced the means to access to power. And the problem that societies in the world all over are facing these days have to do essentially with the fact that governments have been unable to perform well. So I believe that the real problem is not political parties, but the lack of ability of governments to deliver in poor conditions. Governments have been unable to deliver for very obvious reasons. First of all, because it's much more difficult to govern in the era of ubiquitous information, because governments no longer have control of the sources of information, because they compete for information and for communications with the people in general. So the real problem is not political parties. The real problem is that societies in the world are lacking legitimacy. It's interesting to watch that there are a few governments in the world that know how to govern and have succeeded in maintaining the legitimacy of their systems. And in those countries, the political parties are not losing faith. So the real issue for looking forward is to create conditions for the people to have access to the political process without undermining the legitimacy of those societies. And that's not something easy to accomplish. It'll take a dramatic effort of leadership, but not necessarily from politicians. It will take an enormous effort of society and the people to be able to create new forms of participation within which the political parties will always be important. The political parties, however, are fragmenting, are responding to the issue, the reality of fragmentation of societies, and they are not likely to be the ones to lead this process. One ought to look only at the election in the United Kingdom a few weeks ago to realize that this is likely what is likely to happen. There, the Brexit party, which is not looking for power, it's just looking for an issue, was the one who succeeded. So the citizens around the world are going to have to be much more responsible in creating conditions for accessing power and for making it possible for stability and legitimacy to be accomplished.
The best way for companies to surf the digital revolution is to build trust with their customers and to build trust with their employees. One of the ways in which companies can do that is to have frank conversations with the workforce, to sit down with workers and their unions and to say, look, here's the challenges that we're facing, but importantly to ask them, how can we best get there? Because all too often, a lot of those solutions that a company can put in place that will make a real difference, the employees know the answer to that. The best way for companies to surf the digital revolution is to build trust with their customers and to build trust with their employees. One of the ways in which companies can do that is to have frank conversations with the workforce, to sit down with workers and their unions and to say, look, here's the challenges that we're facing, but importantly to ask them, how can we best get there? Because all too often, a lot of those solutions that a company can put in place that will make a real difference, the employees know the answer to that.
Multilateralism is not only the best, in many cases the only way in which you can deal with global issues, because we're dealing with global challenges and therefore you need global solutions, you need multilateral solutions. They take a little longer, yes, of course, but once you get it, then they will stick around for longer, and you will get greater ownership, and therefore you will tend to have more effective solutions. The other way is that, of course, unilateralism is always about who is stronger in a bilateral relationship. And therefore, by going multilateral, what you do is you balance, and all the opinions count. Of course, you always have the bigger countries speak louder, but the differences are less, and also the needs of the smaller countries, the needs of the developing countries, the needs of the groups in a society that are left behind, then they are much better addressed by a multilateral approach. So yes, today we need multilateral more than ever before.
So we had a marvelous meeting in Stockholm. We could address all the issues that are of very great importance for the European and also at the global level. It was marvelously organized by the host of the Swedish chapter, and we appreciated enormously their organization. All the panelists were very, very stimulating and interesting. Many provisional conclusions are coming from this meeting, including the fact that the European wants to be more assertive, perhaps, than they were before in many domains, including the digitalization, the platform at the global level, including industry and research and services at the global level. This idea that Europe as a whole should be, again, more present in the global conversation came very much out of this meeting, which was, again, very comprehensive and stimulating. But you will see that in the various video, perhaps, that you would like to see. Now, I have to give you a new rendezvous. We have rendezvous in Washington, because it would be the trilateral at the level of the three pillars of the trilateral, the entire world, if I may. And this is a Washington meeting which will take place in March 13 to 15. And so there we are with a big rendezvous which would be important, and where we could discuss the global issues in the tradition of the trilateral, with a vision of an open world, a free world, a world which is taking stock of science, technology, and the new wave of innovation, and also respect our fellow citizens, is attached to democracy, is attached to equality produced by the working of a market economy, a vivid market economy. So, à bientôt.
Concluded the meeting here in Stockholm of the European section of the Trilateral Commission. I think it's been a great meeting. I think we've been able to have a dialogue on a lot of the issues that are of concern to all of us. Where are we going on the climate issues? How is the digital transformation going? What is the security really going to look like in the digital world? Where is Russia heading? What are the Americans up to? What will be the consequences of Brexit? So virtually all of the issues that are topical concern to us Europeans at the moment have been on the agenda during these particular 2 days in Stockholm. And then I think we have also been enjoying the company of this very diverse and very interesting and increasingly young group that is the Trilateral Commission Europe.
suppose the question we're all asking is, will the Brexit saga ever end? After 3 years after the referendum, and the British still haven't decided what they want to do, and they're now in an election. I suppose that the answer to the question depends on who wins the election. In order to try and answer that question, you have David Lidington, who was Mrs. May's number 2 in the last government, and who chose not to serve under Mr. Johnson, the current Prime Minister, and he's going to tell us who's going to win the election and whether that's going to bring things to an end. And I'm going to disagree with whatever he says. I suppose the question we're all asking is, will the Brexit saga ever end? After 3 years after the referendum, the British still haven't decided what they want to do, and they're now in an election. I suppose that the answer to the question depends on who wins the election. In order to try and answer that question, you have David Lidington, who was Mrs. May's number 2 in the last government, and who chose not to serve under Mr. Johnson, the current Prime Minister, and he's going to tell us who's going to win the election and whether that's going to bring things to an end. And I'm going to disagree with whatever he says.
I think that the relations between Russia and the European Union are in the stalemate right now. There has been no major movement in either direction since the European Union accepted the so-called 5 Federica Mogherini principles almost 4 years ago. Both sides apparently believe that time is playing on their side and they can sit on their hands waiting for something to change. However, I think that on both sides we see more and more fatigue and more intention to start gradually rebuilding this relationship. I do hope that if the Normandy summit in France turns out to be moderately successful, we might see new openings because, of course, Ukraine remains the major stumbling block on the way to better relations between Moscow and Brussels. If we're able to create at least some positive dynamics there, it would be easy to proceed on other issues where Russia and the European Union have common interests. I think that the relations between Russia and the European Union are in the stalemate right now. There has been no major movement in either direction since the European Union accepted the so-called 5 Federica Mogherini principles almost 4 years ago. Both sides apparently believe that time is playing on their side and they can sit on their hands waiting for something to change. However, I think that on both sides we see more and more fatigue and more intention to start gradually rebuilding this relationship. I do hope that if the Normandy summit in France turns out to be moderately successful, we might see new openings because, of course, Ukraine remains the major stumbling block on the way to better relations between Moscow and Brussels. If we're able to create at least some positive dynamics there, it would be easy to proceed on other issues where Russia and the European Union have common interests.
Technology is not a threat to democracy. I believe that technology can enable our democratic principles of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and really freedom of information so that we can make smart decisions about how and where we want to take the future of our countries. I think we have to be mindful of how the technology can be used against us and educate our citizens about those risks. But I think that technology truly is an enabler of our society and that we should continue to embrace it, not refrain from it. Technology is not a threat to democracy. I believe that technology can enable our democratic principles of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and really freedom of information so that we can make smart decisions about how and where we want to take the future of our countries. I think we have to be mindful of how the technology can be used against us and educate our citizens about those risks. But I think that technology truly is an enabler of our society and that we should continue to embrace it, not refrain from it.
Why do we have so many unicorns up here in Nordic countries? And I think especially if you look at Sweden and Finland, Estonia, of course, in a class of its own. I think that it starts with fantastic education. We really have a foundation of education here in Nordic countries that doesn't kill initiative, doesn't kill creativity. And of course, that is what it takes to be an entrepreneur. You need creativity, you need to be able to take initiative. So I think that's something that is really enabling this whole thing here up in the north. And then, of course, we have fantastic catalysts, events like Slush, that are very, very different from anywhere else in the world. We actually let our young people take charge. So if you look at Slush, you know, it happens every year in Helsinki in Finland. And when you come to this part of the world, you know, be it Stockholm, Helsinki, Tallinn, it's definitely going to be cold, dark, there's going to be slush on the ground. So it's very clear that it's not the Silicon Valley. It's much, much better. And it's much, much better because it's different. We have 2,400 volunteers from more than 60 countries that build this fantastic event called Slush. And it's really the young people, they're volunteering. They're there doing and making that happen because they want to be there, they love to be there. Not because somebody told them that, you know, please do this, please do that. But they're there because they want to be entrepreneurs, they want to make things happen. And they build this event for a few years. The best and biggest on the planet, and after that they go off and they build fantastic startups. So I think that the whole Nordic model is about enabling people to do things and giving the people, the young people and all of us the skills needed to be successful. We also have a fantastic safety net, so we all know that when you try to do new things, more often than not, you fail. And what do you do then? Hopefully you don't end up in the streets, you know, and dying, but actually you try again. And I think that here in the Nordic countries, it's fantastic to be an entrepreneur because you're not, if you fail, you're not going to find yourself without a roof over, your head, but you're actually, you have a safety net. You can go out there and you can try again and again, and before you know it, you build your first unicorn. And after that, hopefully go and build the next one. So I think that is one reason why we have the highest density of unicorns anywhere on the planet here in Nordic countries. And of course, our friends in Estonia are really in a league of their own in this. 1.3 million people, and they have 4 unicorns: Playtech, Skype, TransferWise, and now the latest one being Bolt. 1.3 million people, 4 unicorns. That's more than 10% of all the unicorns in Europe, actually. So the rest of Europe needs to get its act together. And then I think that if you look at this unicorn per capita, in China they have more unicorns than anywhere else, 200, but they also have more people, 1.4 billion people. So if you do the math, in China you need 7 million Chinese people to build just one unicorn company, while in Estonia they are much more efficient. Only roughly 3,000 people one unicorn. So that's actually quite exceptional. So I think that we should all be more like Estonia, and that's something that we can definitely strive to here in Europe. So let's go out there and do things, and we'll end up with lots of new unicorns all over Europe.
For us in the European round table, which gathers the 55 largest companies, most important companies in Europe, Europe's competitiveness absolutely key. The world is changing. We see lesser of continued work for free trade, more protectionism growing in both East and West. And we as companies, we realize that we will not be long-term successful unless Europe is successful. And there are a few challenges that really stick out here. First, it's digitalization. The world is becoming digital through artificial intelligence and through the rollouts of 5G. This opens up for huge opportunities in every single part of society. But Europe is lagging behind here. We need to speed up there. We need to invest more, do more. Then we have the Green Deal. Europe is in the lead in this. And this is an area where we can take advantage of business opportunities, and it's important, of course, for the planet. So that's an area where we also have to come together. And then, of course, we are believers in free trade or free trade under agreed rules, and this is now a threat, and we need to stand up for it. But also, we need to be realistic and make sure that we navigate this new landscape in an effective way. For us in the European round table, which gathers the 55 largest companies, most important companies in Europe, Europe's competitiveness absolutely key. The world is changing. We see lesser of continued work for free trade, more protectionism growing in both East and West. And we as companies, we realize that we will not be long-term successful unless Europe is successful. And there are a few challenges that really stick out here. First, it's digitalization. The world is becoming digital through artificial intelligence and through the rollouts of 5G. This opens up for huge opportunities in every single part of society. But Europe is lagging behind here. We need to speed up there. We need to invest more, do more. Then we have the Green Deal. Europe is in the lead in this. And this is an area where we can take advantage of business opportunities, and it's important, of course, for the planet. So that's an area where we also have to come together. And then, of course, we are believers in free trade or free trade under agreed rules, and this is now a threat, and we need to stand up for it. But also, we need to be realistic and make sure that we navigate this new landscape in an effective way.
So I am a complete believer of public policy and the power that it can have in moving the market. I believe in strong states that can send the correct signals to markets to move in the direction we want. What states can do is actually to promote the good and tax the bad. And states are there to promote the greatest public good. I have experiences in many, many parts of the world where bold and clever public policy has actually ramped up industrial competitiveness and the growth of markets, in particular renewable energy markets. I can state the case of Latin America, of several Latin American countries, for example, in the case of Mexico, in the past few decades, bold policy in giving a clear vision as well as renewable energy targets and leaving the markets to set up the prices was and drove the lowest solar price for renewable energy in the world in 2017. You can count that example and many other examples where bold public policy has actually catalyzed an industrial revolution for the good. We are in a moment of a planetary emergency. We are both in a nature crisis as well as in a climate crisis, and if the states don't raise up their bar and put strong policies in place, it's going to be difficult that we get where we want to get. Businesses are waiting, progressive businesses are waiting, but if we don't have a common playing ground, it's going to be difficult for us to ramp up the mass of the businesses and non-state actors that are ready to act.
Us a big strength. We just concluded agreements with Canada, with Japan, with Singapore, with Mexico, and others are in negotiations. But of course, with the changing climate, with countries not respecting WTO rules, countries going increasingly bilateral, there is a challenge there. So we are looking at how to reform our policies, of course, to be still able to do trade agreements, to strengthen the WTO and reform it with other like-minded countries, but also to protect ourselves against countries who are not playing according to the rules, and to make sure that the European, the level playing field is respected. We have changed our trade defense mechanisms. We have implemented a coordination mechanism for investment screening, and we are looking at how to sharpen our tools, and this will be a key issue for the new Commission coming in as well.
December, the time to complete the first chapter. Either Boris Johnson will win, in which case Britain will exit the European Union on or about the end of January 2020, or alternatively, if there is a majority for the opposition parties combined, then there will be a second referendum in the middle of next year. But the trouble is, neither of those outcomes is going to settle things definitively, because the second referendum, it might well lead to a narrow vote to remain in the EU, but that would not end the division in the United Kingdom. And of course, if Mr Johnson wins his majority, then we've got to negotiate the new relationship on trade, on security, on foreign policy cooperation between the United Kingdom, which will remain a big European power, a major player in defence and security and economic terms, but it's going to be next door to the European Union. Those 27 countries are going to be my country's most important trading partner, our closest geographical democratic neighbours for as far ahead as I can possibly see. So working that through is going to take, I fear, a year, more than a year, I would estimate. And I think there's a real responsibility both on UK political leaders but also on EU political leaders to get this right. European democracy is under massive strain from Russian aggression, from dramatic economic change that is adding to public mistrust in the way in which we do business. So getting the geopolitics right, having a constructive future relationship between the UK and our neighbours in the EU 27 is important for the whole of the European democratic community.
conflicts, and even the word war is, I think, a bit overstated because wars end up being zero-sum. One wins, one loses. And in the case of trade, it should be a win-win operation. So I think the analogy is mistaken, and by closing off your own markets, you increase costs to your own people. In the United States, about 50% of imports are for commodities or intermediate goods, so if you raise those costs, you raise costs for manufacturers and consumers in the United States, or same would be the case in Europe. And in the case of the US and China, I think that we're in a very dangerous situation. I think that there are many reasons and frustrations with China. Some of them are justifiable about forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights, reciprocity. There's also concerns about Chinese security and other policies. But I think you can find allies within China on a number of the trade issues, and you actually want to try to keep pushing both sides to a rules-based system. So I think that the path that we're on with China has led to more of confrontation. And in fact, what you're probably going to need to see is some combination of competition, cooperation, and confrontation, or at least drawing lines on some issues. So I think with a country as big as China, you need a more multifaceted policy.
Gamification and game-based learning indeed is the future of lifelong learning. I believe that because as we train the new generations in the workforce, we know that we need to create materials that are a lot more engaging, that are a lot more useful, and that are going to have an impact in the way that they learn and in the way that they acquire the new skills that they need in order to remain competitive in the marketplace. What a better way to do that than through video games? As children, we learn through playing, and we believe that through gamification and through game-based learning, we can make learning fun again, not only for children, which we know is the best way to learn, but also from adults. If they play these video games, they will become more engaged, as I said earlier. They will also acquire that knowledge much more deeply, and they will be able to apply that knowledge in their daily jobs. And finally, by doing the video games through the simulators, they will be able to have experiential learning to get the feedback on what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and learn from that.
Very clearly, I think the world is moving towards a circular economy. It's a necessity. When you look at water scarcity, when you look at waste pollution, everybody is now aware of that. If we want to make a conciliation between the planet for our children and economic development, we need to move towards a circular economy, and by education, by innovation, by a different way of doing business, both for citizens and also by companies, we will make this move, which will help us collectively to have a planet great again. Thank you.
The future of entertainment in the 21st century is going to be shaped by the twin forces of globalization and digitalization, both of which are going to be terrific for consumers. Digitalization means that people will be able to consume entertainment wherever and whenever they want, and globalization means that that opportunity will be given to people around the globe. While there's some concern that large companies are going to dominate the future of the entertainment landscape, I actually have a different view, because I feel that digitalization
is very empowering to creators. And when you think about a phenomenon like YouTube and user-generated consumption, these are powerful, powerful forces. Similarly, digitalization has allowed the falling of distribution barriers. So not only is production much easier, but the ability to distribute it to people is much easier. And we're really living in a golden age of entertainment with many more choices than we have. And that also means a greater democratization of ideas. And again, all of this is happening on a global scale, which is really enabled by digital technology.
I would say that the characteristics of a Nordic education system is that, first of all, we have a very inclusive system based on public funding where there should be a room for all. I think students are taught to think independently, a lot of critical thinking, and also quite a lot of creativity baked into our education. I would especially commend the Finnish system where they put their best teachers for the youngest students, and they use a lot of resources in preschool and also first to third grade to ensure that the children are best possibly equipped for future learning. And I believe that that's the best investment you can make, is to invest in the kids when they're really young, so you lay the foundation for their future learning.
What is actually the biggest threat from cybersecurity for Europe? Of course, we can concentrate and focus on the security side, but I would take it a bit on the other side, that if we really go to focus too much on the security side, then it really will slow down our development. I think it is the biggest threat is that we lose competitiveness. And that is for me the whole part, because if we want to be leaders in innovation, we should also know innovation, it has two aspects. First, I think you must have a great idea, but you must be the first. So that means speed. And we must make sure that I think we have an ability to be innovative and to be the first and to have speed. So for me, that is the biggest threat of cybersecurity, to get a slow down. What is actually the biggest threat from cybersecurity for Europe? Of course, we can concentrate and focus on the security side, but I would take it a bit on the other side, that if we really go to focus too much on the security side, then it really will slow down our development. I think it is the biggest threat is that we lose competitiveness. And that is for me the whole part, because if we want to be leaders in innovation, we should also know innovation, it has two aspects. First, I think you must have a great idea, but you must be the first. So that means speed. And we must make sure that I think we have an ability to be innovative and to be the first and to have speed. So for me, that is the biggest threat of cybersecurity, to get a slow down.
So are we suffering from eco-anxiety? The simple answer is yes, possibly too much. Eco-anxiety is definitely triggered by the fact that we are facing a very urgent matter with climate, but at the same time, it's also because we're facing something that is very complex. It's very difficult to understand the impact of climate change, and it's very difficult to understand the solutions to reach a low-carbon economy. So in the world of investment where I am, what I see is those who are actually acting every
investments and low carbon economy investments are actually less susceptible to eco-anxiety because they can see the result and the impact of what they do. But really what is needed to decrease this anxiety is more examples of impactful investment, change of behavior in society that would actually bring people to less anxiety.
Situation where U.S. and West European support for Ukraine was very well coordinated, and we were maintaining a consistent pressure on Russia to begin to negotiate seriously about ending its occupation of eastern Ukraine. Unfortunately, I think now the impeachment dynamics in the U.S. have really knocked U.S. policy off the table. We don't have the people, we don't have the engagement, we don't have the same focus. And as a result, I think that takes a lot of the pressure off of Russia to negotiate. I'm hopeful that as we have a Normandy format summit, possibly on December 9th, it may take a little bit longer, that can retain some of that negotiating dynamic. But I'm afraid that right now the situation is much more difficult for Ukraine than it should be.
The role of civil society in modern Russia? I would say it's a very important issue. Why? Because in Russia, political competition is limited, there are no real opposition parties, so the society stands up to the autocratic regime through organizing itself, through building trust, through providing public goods that the corrupt and inefficient state cannot provide. And it's not just protesting corruption, it's not just about asking for democracy and rule of law. Civil society today is working on helping the poor, helping the disadvantaged, fighting domestic violence, promoting gender equality, defending minorities. So this is actually where the European future for Russia is. And luckily, with the new communication technology, with internet, it's easier to organize itself, it's easier to inform itself, and it's easier to promote change, creating new Russia that eventually will become part of Greater Europe.
At a time when 1,000 NATO troops are stationed at the border between Estonia and Russia to deter possible Russian aggression, when President Macron is speaking about what he calls cercle concentrique, when citizens in Moldova and Georgia are questioning whether Europe and the US will come to rescue if there is a security guarantee, and when sanctions against Russia and counter embargoes have become kind of the very essence of the idea of a European security policy, well, what can we expect from Russia? We know that Putin is actually more popular than most of his competitors. But will Medvedev be a different leader than Putin? In short, can we expect a different kind of trajectory from Russia in the coming years when the bureaucratic elite inside Russia is focusing more on digitalization than what some might call modernization? As always, the views on Russia are diverging.
The school of the future for the adult workforce will essentially not be a school. Many people will have to continue to learn, continue to reskill, continue to upskill, but they'll do that inside their workplace. We will need to ensure that at least 2 to 3 months of learning are
integrated into every single year that somebody is at work. The second thing that we know is that the fourth industrial revolution is changing workplaces and the needs of the labor force so quickly that we're also going to need to quite fundamentally reform education systems. And that applies to the delivery and it also applies to the content. One, we need much more technology integrated into schools. And second, we need to ensure that young children are understanding how to apply these technologies in the future, understanding how to collaborate with each other rather than compete with each other, and understand how to apply critical thinking so that they're able to continue to learn throughout their life course.
Basically, when you look at the state of innovation in Europe, I think there are three fundamental trends that you need to be aware of, or these are sort of three fundamental facts of how innovation has been evolving over the last few years. And I would say that those three are: the first is that talent is being concentrated in very tight and small clusters, and this is very atypical and unexpected. We thought the digital economy would distribute talent geographically and people would simply connect to processes of different types, but the truth of the matter is that actually there's something about knowledge, particularly this form tacit knowledge, that doesn't travel very well. So we're seeing these very tight clusters emerge in places like Boston or Silicon Valley or Hong Kong or Singapore or others around particular areas of knowledge. But the second development that I think is significant is that we're also seeing a concentration of productivity growth in very particular companies, what the OECD calls frontier firms. And productivity over the last 10 years has really skyrocketed in those firms, but has stalled in every other firm within the market. So a few firms have become highly competitive and more so over time, and others are just simply falling behind in terms of growth. The third fact that I think is significant is the geographic distribution of those companies and of innovation. So we can see that China and the US concentrate almost all of the startups that we could term unicorns that have a value of more than $1 billion today, mostly again in China and in the US. So there are big gaps around the world, there are a few in Europe. So what this depicts is a world of concentrated talent, concentrated productivity growth, and an empty hinterland with these very particular clusters of startups and innovators. And this poses, I think, major challenges to Europe. Fundamentally, I would say two. One is we need to attract these firms if we want to have high quality and numerous jobs in the future, and we need to attract these companies if we want to have fiscal traction and be able to fund public services moving forward and sustain our social contract. So if I was a policymaker, and this is my final message, and it has been in the session today, it would be we need to focus our economic policy on developing these frontier firms, providing them with the talent, providing them with the frameworks and the capacity to grow and do well and innovate and bring wealth, jobs, and tax revenue to Europe. And if we don't do this, I think we're going to face a major challenge of employment and public service funding. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut today to discuss how oil and energy will shape our post-pandemic future with special guest Megan O'Sullivan, Director of the Geopolitics of Energy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. Megan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, or good afternoon, Megan. Good to see you.
Good to see you. I am Megan Torrey, the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and before we get started with today's important discussion, I want to acknowledge that we are experiencing a very painful time in our nation. This has been a difficult few weeks, and it has sparked a national and global conversation on systemic injustice within our country. As an organization that was founded in 1924 on the fundamental belief and principle of making the world a better place, we take seriously our responsibility to facilitate dialogue on global issues. This Friday, we're hosting 3 special events on race and inequality, and we invite all of you to join us. More information on each event will be available and shared at the conclusion of today's discussion, or you can visit ctwac.org. And with us today, we are so lucky. I'm so looking forward to this conversation to have Megan O'Sullivan with us. She is also author of Windfall, How the New Energy Abundance Upends Global Politics. Megan has served as Special Assistant to President George W. Bush, Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan, and Vice Chair of the All-Party Talks in Northern Ireland, amongst many other leadership roles. And she also sits on the board of Raytheon Technologies, and I know so many in our listening audience work for Raytheon Technologies. So Megan, welcome.
Thank you again. I'm pleased to be here, and thank you for acknowledging the difficult time our country is having now, and I'm pleased to hear that you'll be doing some conversations about that later this week.
Thank you. So we have so much to talk about today, so I want to dive right in if that's all right. So from COVID crisis to an oil price war, today we're experiencing massive oil market disruption. Can you talk us through the current state of the global oil markets and how we got to this point?
Sure. As you suggested, and your viewers will be very aware, this has been an unprecedented moment in oil markets. It's been an unprecedented moment in history, but the oil markets have felt this acutely. And I would say the easiest way to describe it is that oil markets in the last 3 months have experienced an unprecedented combination of a supply shock and a demand shock. The supply shock was basically the result of a tussle between Saudi Arabia and Russia over whether they should cut production to try to respond to the decrease in demand for energy that was coming out of China when China was first hit with the COVID crisis. When we look back on that conversation, it almost seems quaint because they were talking about numbers that were so small compared to the enormity of the problem that was to come. Essentially, they couldn't find an agreement, and what happened at the beginning of March is that the parties decided that they would move to a place where they would no longer restrain production to boost price, but they would produce as much as they could to capture market share, and that would in fact end up bringing down the price considerably because so much more oil was added to the global market. The demand shock, however, was much more significant than the supply additions that the Russians and the Saudis put on the market. The demand shock has been massive. Think about the world was consuming 100 million barrels of oil a day in February of this year. That dropped by 20 million barrels of oil a day later in the quarter. In April, maybe even more. We're still trying to get fidelity on those numbers. But a huge drop in demand that resulted basically from the immobilization of the global economy. And this is kind of what took us to that period where we had negative oil prices in the United States, and we also had an unprecedented global response to the collapse of oil markets because it was important not just for oil producers, but also something of this magnitude has real implications for the global economy. So we did see an effort to kind of restore balance to the market with an agreement that came about in mid-April, and we've started to see oil markets regain their footing. Prices are now back up to about $35–40 a barrel, which is still quite low, but certainly much better than it was a few weeks ago if you're looking at it from the perspective of oil producers.
So we know that we're going through this disruption, and oftentimes disruption or crisis present different opportunities. So how does this disruption, what potential does it have to transform geopolitics in the global world?
Sure. It's a big question, and I would simply, the lens that I look at this from is that energy has always been a really big driver of global politics. That's what my whole book that you mentioned at the outset, Windfall, is about. So often we don't think about energy as a driver of foreign policy, but it is. Energy, and if we think about oil in particular, has defined alliances. It's defined, who has power in the international system. It has been the spark for wars, and sometimes been the impetus for cooperation. So, energy has always been a big driver of foreign policy. And what we see is when there are big disruptions, as the one we're talking about in energy, and oil in particular, that often leads to big changes in energy. So this moment certainly has been a big one for oil and gas and energy, generally speaking. And how its geopolitical impacts will unfold really depend on how long-lasting this disruption is. Whether or not demand comes back for oil, or whether it remains tapered out for some time and it creates a window for renewables and alternatives to come forward. So I would say there's one, I'll be about for a long time, but the world has been very slow to act on. So it's possible these changes could accelerate that, and that could bring about a lot of geopolitical implications in terms of removing oil as a real source of power and elevating countries that invest in technologies that have to do with renewables and a variety of other things. But even if that dramatic outcome doesn't occur in the immediate short term, we have a lot of countries around the world that are experiencing major economic duress because of this collapse in oil prices. And this is going to cause a lot of politics to shift trajectories. Saudi Arabia is one of them. Their reform efforts are going to be more difficult. Russia, it's interesting. A lot of talk about Putin's hand being a little diminished in Russia these days because of the combination of the oil price collapse and the COVID crisis. And we can also talk about how U.S.-China relations have been affected by all of this. So I definitely think even if we don't see a big impetus to an energy transition, although I hope we do, even if we don't, we're going to see some lasting geopolitical imprints.
So thank you, and I just want to remind our audience to ask Megan a question. Please use the Q&A button that's on your screen, and to interact with your fellow audience members, you can use the chat function. So I want to stay there for a second, Megan. Let's talk about China and the U.S.-China relationship. And do you see the potential for China to emerge as a global leader after the, during and after the recovery of this COVID crisis? Do you think China will become a driver of alternative forms of energy?
Sure. Well, there's a lot in that question. I mean, the U.S.-China relationship, like all of these questions. So, the U.S.-China relationship, is really in a downward spiral. I would say experts, people who've been watching this relationship for decades, say this is really the worst moment since 1978. That's when Deng Xiaoping opened up the economy. And that it is a worse relationship than it was after Tiananmen Square, which says quite a lot. And I think it's a combination of factors. The relationship was already on rocky footing, and there was a change in there's a change in the American political attitude, both of Democrats and Republicans, about the proper way for the U.S. to interact with China, even before the COVID crisis. But the COVID crisis has really accelerated this in a pretty dramatic fashion. What does this mean, as you asked, for China's global leadership role, first just in general, and then when it comes to renewable energies? I think it's very much an open question. I think China's standing has taken a hit internationally, but I'd also point out that the U.S. standing has taken a hit internationally as well. And so I think, and this is true not just for the politics of both countries and for the global image and soft power of both countries, but also for their economies. And so the question is which country is better poised to recover from this, to take advantage of this global disruption and assert themselves and their leadership. Again, a lot remains open, but certainly China has shown more of a desire to do that. The United States seems to be retreating from global leadership roles rather than looking for opportunities to enhance them. But China has some, domestic challenges to handle as well. In terms of renewable energy, China definitely was positioning itself to be a global leader in that, in terms of its investments, its commitments, its national strategies, and also because the United States does not have a national strategy to be a leader in what will be an incredibly important sector for the global economy going forward. So China, I think their focus has shifted a little bit since the COVID crisis, focusing more on just ensuring there's enough economic growth to prevent social unrest. But I imagine that they haven't lost sight of the importance of green energy in their overall economic strategy.
So I'm going to incorporate an audience question, and so we're going to take a little tour around the world. We have an audience question about how has the oil crisis and the COVID crisis impacted sort of the geopolitical situation in Venezuela?
Sure. Venezuela, when you think about countries that are vulnerable to oil shocks and major decreases in the price of oil, you would immediately think of Venezuela, because over the last couple of decades, Venezuela has become one of the most oil-dependent countries in the world, in the sense that it used to be a more vibrant economy, but over the span of the last 2 decades or so, basically, Venezuela had imported everything that it consumed except for oil, essentially, and that oil played such a major role. What has happened over the last several years with Maduro in power and the United States really putting pressure on that economy is that Venezuela is still oil dependent, but its oil exports are just a mere fraction of what they were a few years ago when Venezuela was such a major oil exporter. So a massive decline in the oil price hurts Venezuela, but not as dramatically as it might have a few years ago when Venezuela was actually exporting a whole lot. That said, Venezuela is very scarce on foreign currency, so any diminution is a challenge for the regime. And COVID, we really don't know. The questioner asked about COVID. We really don't know the extent of the COVID virus in Venezuela, but my fear is that it is pretty significant, bordering on Brazil, which of course is struggling greatly with the crisis, and the fact that Venezuela has basically no safety net, no organized health system still in place to help people. So I think this is a real crisis for Venezuela. It was already a country in a real crisis, and I think that if what can we expect? I think we can expect more Venezuelans to leave the country, so more regional disruption. And there's also the possibility that this could catalyze, could kind of unstick some of the politics in the country where Maduro had been appearing to gain an upper hand over the opposition, that maybe these two forces, the oil price collapse and the COVID crisis, will bring about some new dynamics, and hopefully some of them will create opportunities.
So let's talk about a region that you know very well, the Middle East, and how oil and the oil markets are impacting tension in the region.
Sure. I mean, the Middle East is a very heterogeneous place, and so we tend to think about this, particularly in the context of oil, low oil prices being bad for the countries of the Middle East, and I think that's not a wrong supposition, but we also have to keep in mind that there are a lot of countries in the region that are big, they're importers of oil. They actually don't produce oil. If you look at Egypt or Jordan or countries that are important to the region and to U.S. interests. So there's a varied impact of this. But in general, I think the big picture is that you have countries that fall into one of two categories. The first categories are countries that certainly do not, this is not a useful, I'm talking about producers that don't want to see prices this low, but they have policy tools that enable them to kind of weather the storm. And I put Saudi Arabia in that category. Saudi Arabia can raise debt on international markets. It's increased its VAT tax by, it's tripled it in the last couple of months. It has the ability to rein in expenditures. It has policy tools to deal with it. It still is going to be, I would say, weakened by this crisis because this crisis really detracts from Saudi Arabia's ability to pursue big economic reforms, which were really the focal point of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's endeavors. And it makes it much harder to move away from an oil economy when there's no excess revenues to invest in non-oil industries. So there are impacts on a country like Saudi Arabia, but they're not as immediate as that second category of countries where I put Iraq in there, maybe Algeria, Oman, other countries that really don't have a lot of wiggle room. They don't have a pillow. They find that low oil prices mean they can't even pay wages, never mind fund health budgets. Security budgets are going to remain unfunded. So this could create some real economic and potentially security points of instability in the Middle East, on top of a region that we already know is struggling with all of these things.
Fantastic. So let's move in, domestically now. So in your book, Windfall, you outline how the oil boom and gas produced by fracking bolstered the U.S. power globally. How will the U.S. oil industry be affected by this unprecedented moment, and what does that mean for both large and smaller companies?
Sure. So this is an extremely painful moment for U.S. oil producers. We saw a remarkable shift in President Trump's attitude towards oil prices back in April. In March, he was tweeting, hey, low oil prices, that's great, good for the consumer. But he clearly had a change of heart in April when domestic overall economy, America's oil industry, it's one of the numbers out there is that 11 million people are employed directly or indirectly by the oil industry. So there was a shift in attitude towards this and an effort. President Trump got very heavily involved in an effort to actually get an OPEC agreement, which is remarkable in itself, such a huge departure for where the president has been in the past. This, of course, has helped U.S. industry as well as others, but the U.S. industry is still in a very, very difficult spot. To be concise, I would say that there's a lot of debate about what this is going to mean for the U.S. sector. We've already seen a contraction of production that has been very significant. People think it's anywhere from 1.6 million barrels of oil a day all the way up to 3 or 4, and this is out of a total of 13 before the crisis hit. So significant contraction. I would say just two things. One, I have a lot of confidence in this industry that it is not under threat in the way that many people have portrayed it, that it is not under an existential threat as an industry. There are companies that are under an existential threat, and there are many companies that will not survive this downturn. But this doesn't mean industry will disappear. It means industry will change. We'll see a consolidation. We'll see larger companies, more efficient companies emerge stronger and probably absorb a lot of those smaller companies. So I think we're going to still see a healthy and robust industry after this very painful period. And America, in my mind, will still remain a major energy superpower, even if its production numbers are not quite as high as they were in February of 2020.
One of the things that you have talked a lot about is the world being on the cusp of a global geopolitical reset. Can you explain what you mean by that and how oil and energy markets can set the stage for significant geopolitical shifts?
Sure. Well, it gets at what I was talking about earlier about how when you get changes in the energy markets, this really, because it changes the power base of countries, it creates new opportunities and new challenges to existing institutions and structures. So I'll give a different example than the ones I gave earlier. There's a really interesting question out there about global energy governance. For many of the last decades, the global energy governance has been roughly divided into producers, OPEC, and consumers, an organization called the International Energy Agency, which was founded after the 1973 Arab oil embargo of the United States and a couple other countries. So you've had producers and consumers, and they've kind of looked after their own interests, and that has been the framework for the last several decades. And what this last episode has shown us, what was fairly evident, but there was never a real impetus to look it in the face, is that framework doesn't really work that much anymore. If you look at the world's largest oil and gas producer, that is actually the United States, as well as the United States being one of the world's largest consumers. Actually, China, the world's largest consumer of energy, also is one of the world's largest producers of oil. So we now have this kind of, it's in flux. If a country is it a big producer, is it a big consumer, is it both? How does it fit into this structure? And again, what we saw in April was this push to actually have a different kind of conversation between producers and consumers. This one was heavily facilitated by individual personalities. It wasn't institutionalized, but now there's a lot of conversation about, do we need a different kind of architecture for global energy governance? I'm not sure that one will emerge, but certainly it's an open question and one that could lead to a different kind and rhythm of conversation.
I'm going to bring in a few more audience questions. Back to China for a second. So today, the United States Department of Treasury announced that it will no longer allow Chinese airlines to fly to the United States starting mid-June of this month. How do you think that's going to impact the U.S.-China relationship?
I think it's just another step in this downward spiral in the bilateral relationship. It's certainly not going to keep people from going to China or keep Chinese people from coming to the United States, and that is a good thing. However, I think it is a point in a direction that I find will have major implications for the global economy. And we've heard a lot of talk, even before COVID, about the possibility of China and the U.S. decoupling their economies. And I think what we're China. Some of it will be policy, but some of it will be companies who will look at the events of the trade war between the US and China that preceded the COVID crisis, and they'll say, hey, we need to reprioritize our supply chains. We no longer can be so dependent on China. I think there's a lot, and I think this is legitimate, just for what it's worth, there's a lot of concern about how dependent many companies and the country's economy as a whole is on Chinese supply chain. So I think, in the words of a friend of mine who also writes for Bloomberg, Mohammed Al-Arian, he said, we're going to see companies move away from a focus on efficiency to a focus on resilience. And that, will have some definite benefits, but a downside will be kind of a little bit of a decoupling or a movement away from globalization. And I think this is something that should concern us all, in part because it will mean that we're going to move to a world most likely of lower growth. And there's lots of implications about living in a world of lower growth, not just for the United States, but for a lot of people in emerging markets in the developing world as well.
Let's talk about Iran for a second. Another question from the audience. How does this oil price uncertainty impact Iran, given its high rate of COVID infection and the impacts of the U.S. sanctions?
Sure, and this is Iran is a country, it's remarkable to me that it's not in the news more now, because it just shows you how much news there is, right? Because really, if you're somebody who watches the Middle East, you're pretty concerned about the level of provocation happening out of Iran and the potential for the U.S. and Iran getting into an uncomfortable situation again, much like the one that we were at the beginning of January. I mean, it seems like 1,000 years ago, but if you remember at the beginning of January, we were faced with the killing of Qasem Soleimani, senior Iranian government military figure, and the real possibility that the U.S. and Iran would be involved in a kind of a hot conflict. I think that the combination of the economic unrest, keep in mind Iran's economy was under major economic pressure, largely due to sanctions of the United States before the COVID crisis. And the Iranian regime was also having issues related to its own credibility. One of the remarkable things of 2019 was that we were seeing protests against the Iranian government in Iran. We were also seeing them in Iraq. So the Iranian regime had a legitimacy problem going back a year ago, or many years ago, but we were seeing manifestations of it a year ago. Then you have the shooting down of a civilian airliner by the Iranian military. Then you have the COVID crisis, which really was pretty devastating in Iran. And then you have a further oil price collapse, which harms Iran, but very much the same way as Venezuela. All of this creates enormous stress on the society and presumably on the Iranian government, leading us to really, I think we should be paying attention to the fact that we don't know how the Iranian government is going to react, that it could certainly be an impetus for more provocation, more lashing out, and this could lead to a further confrontation between the U.S. and Iran. So that's definitely something that I would be watching more if our radars were not so overloaded with 101 other pressing issues.
Absolutely. So we're almost out of time, but as our last question, so if we're on the cusp of this global reset, this great opportunity, can you walk us through what your best case scenario would be?
Sure. I'm going to interpret that as relating to the energy realm, but there are other ways I could think about it, because I'd like to think, just actually moving above the energy realm, I'd like to think that the world could emerge from this moment with new patterns of international cooperation. I feel like that is what is needed, which is definitely needed. We think about the challenges facing us, the pandemic being the most obvious and the most immediate, but climate change being another one, certainly the global economy being another one. These are all things that one country cannot fix on their own, cannot insulate itself from on its own. And so these issues demand global coordination and cooperation to address them in the best way possible, in the most equitable way possible. So to me, I think, what this moment underscores is the need for cooperation. And as an American, for me, it underscores the need for American leadership. America has, it is, I think, devastating to many people to see that America has not taken a leadership role and in fact has withdrawn from the WHO during this period of global need. So that's what I'd like to see. If I were putting a bet on whether that would emerge as the dominant scenario, I wouldn't place zero on that scenario. I think a lot depends on our November election. But I think that's certainly not the direction we're heading, and that concerns me. So the best case scenario, more global cooperation, more kind of acknowledgement of this critical moment and how it exposes some of the inequalities and inequities in our society, and taking the opportunity that is created by the moment and by the fact that, speaking as an American, many Americans have suddenly now overnight gotten used to the idea that the government is going to be a bigger part of their daily lives. Well, that could be a negative, but it could also be a positive if our government puts in place certain strategies that prioritize things like an energy transition that are going to be really important to our well-being over the long run.
Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we've only scratched the surface here, so hopefully we'll be able to welcome you back, and hopefully in person. And stay safe and well out there.
Thank you, Megan. It's been a pleasure. Have a good afternoon.
Welcome to Illuminati Silver. We tell the truth about silver. Today is Saturday, the 26th of February, 2022. We're publishing our Gold and Silver Weekly Update for the week ending the 25th of February. And what a turbulent week it has been. Certainly one to test traders' nerves, that's for sure. So let's take a look. Well, looking at gold and silver, we can see that gold fell $8 last week, falling from 1897 to 1889, having hit a high of 1974, the highest in 8 years, and a low of 1881, a fall of 0.4%. In sterling terms, gold finished the week at £14.09. That's up £13. And in euros, it closed at €1,676. That's unchanged. Silver did better, proportionally. It rose 30 cents, rising from $23.97 to $24.27, having hit a high of $25.64 and a low of $23.71, a rise of 1.25%. In sterling terms, silver closed at £18.10. That's up 47 pence. And in euros, it closed at 21.53 euros. That's up 0.36 euros. The gold to silver ratio fell from 79.1 to 1 to 77.8 to 1. Like equities, cryptocurrencies were extremely volatile, and Bitcoin ended up down $717 and currently stands at $39,257. Though it was down over $5,000 at one stage on Thursday. The Dow Jones closed on Friday at 34,058. That's up 834 points on the day and down 21 on the week. The S&P 500 closed at 4,385, up 95 on the day and up 37 on the week. And the Nasdaq Composite closed at 13,694, up 221 points on the day and up 146 points on the week. Looking at oils, which were also quite turbulent, Brent crude closed at $97.93. Now that's up a whopping $4.39 on the week, though it did touch $104, and had it stayed there, obviously would have been up around $10 for the week. And WTI crude closed at $91.59. That's just a rise of 52 cents. So WTI crude prices, whilst they also rose quite considerably, underperformed compared with Brent crude. The dollar index stands at 96.61, and that's up 0.57 on the week, though again it was well over 97 and a quarter see gold trading between 1850 and 1950, and 1825 to 1975 as outliers. We see silver trading between 23.25 and 24.75, and 22.75 to 25.50 as outliers. Well, we're pleased we extended the gold outlier range to 1975, based on a possible invasion of the Ukraine, and to see gold peak at 1974, $1 less, was indeed gratifying, as was the fallback to our normal trading range by the end of the week. The difference between its high and low for gold was $93, which was the largest for some considerable time. Silver closed well within our normal trading range and operated within it for much of the week. The invasion of Ukraine did, however, push it 14 cents higher than our outlier range. Only we'd said $25.75 instead of $25.50. The difference between its high and low for the week was $1.93. Again, like gold, one of its largest moves for some considerable time. Obviously, price movements were dictated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which caused gold and silver prices to skyrocket and equities and cryptos to plummet, only to recover again later that day, which was an impressive turnaround. Indeed, so much so that yesterday we published a review entitled "What Will It Take for Gold to Hit $2,000?" And we've placed a link to that below. Please listen to that. It covers some interesting aspects of tie-in, also with our gold price forecast that we published earlier in the week. Now, whilst all eyes were on Russia last week, some interesting economic data was announced by the United States. Market manufacturing and services flash PMIs were higher than expected, as was the consumer confidence index. Initial jobless claims were down, as was continuing jobless claims. On the negative side, though, PCE inflation, both monthly and year-over-year, were higher, as was, though, real consumer spending for January. Both actions must now suggest a rate rise surely in March. Now, before we take a more in-depth look at gold and silver, it's worth looking at what data is coming out of the US this week. On Monday, we have the Chicago PMI for February. Tuesday, market manufacturing final PMI and the ISM manufacturing index for February, and construction spending in January. Wednesday, we have the ADP employment report for February, which may suggest what's going to happen on Friday, and on Thursday, of course, the regular jobless claims, and the market services final PMI and the ISM services index, both for February. And we have factory orders for January. Then on Friday, the all-important non-farm payrolls, unemployment rate, and average hourly earnings, all for February. So an important week, and in our view, the final determinant week, as far as data is concerned, to enable the FOMC to finally make up its mind about interest rates when it meets on the 15th and 16th of March. Geopolitically, we still have Russian-Ukraine issue, which will no doubt continue for some time. And this will capture most of the headlines for the duration of next week, we suspect. So what is gold looking like technically? Well, it's resting at a major support level of 1888, which is where the 10-day moving average rests, and it has obviously psychologically strong support at 1850, and then extremely strong support at the 50-week EMA at $18. Resistance is seen near June's highs of 1,916. The MACD histogram is suggesting consolidation. We should not ignore the fact that gold still fell, even as the dollar value also fell on Friday. Like gold, silver prices also fell after their burst forward on Thursday morning. Support is seen near the 10-day moving average of 23.93 and resistance at the 200-day moving average of $24.21. Like gold, the MACD is suggesting consolidation. Russia has said that it will consider talks if the Ukraine lays down its arms, while the Ukrainian president stated last night that they will continue to fight. So once again, a prediction for gold and silver this coming week is going to be extremely difficult,
and once again, I'm entirely dependent on Russia and Ukraine. That said, there is important economic data being presented, which is likely to have an effect, especially towards the end of the week. So with this in mind, we see gold really trading between 1840 and 1940, and 1810 to 1960 as outliers, though we will be surprised if it gets that high. We see silver trading between 23.50 and 25, and 22.75 to 25.40 as outliers. What do you think? Please do share your thoughts. Meanwhile, thank you for listening. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to the channel. Not forgetting to press the bell sign so you're notified of our videos as and when they're published. And as always, we wish you a safe, enjoyable weekend and prosperous week ahead. Illuminati silver owners come from a background of banking, international wealth management and economics. Having now retired from these worlds, we are not qualified to give investment advice. Therefore, this and other productions must not be deemed to be giving such advice and merely represent the personal views of its owners.
ለሁለት ዓመታት የገበረ የሚባለው የሚስጥራዊ ማህበረሰብ መስራች በ20ኛው መቶ ክፍለ ዘመን እጅግ ሚስጥሩ የበዛ ሰው ይሉታል። በወጣትነቱ የ3ኛ ዲግሪ PhD በመያዝ ከተመረቀበት ዩኒቨርሲቲና ከአውሮፓ ክብረ ወሰን እስከዛሬ 58 ዓመቱን በጠላት በተያዘ ግዛት በጦርነት መሃል አየር ጃንጥላ ፓራሹት በመውረድም እስካሁን የደረሰ በ30 ዓመታት ያህል የተወለደባትን ምድር ነፃ ሀገር ትሆን ዘንድ ቢጥርም ከነፃነት በኋላ አልኖረባትም። ሁሉም የአውሮፓ ሀገሮች ሁሉንም ማለት ይቻላል የላቲን አሜሪካን፣ ሜክሲኮ የሀገሩ ያህል ኖሮባቸዋል። የሚገርመው የኖረባቸው ሀገሮች መሪዎችን በሙሉ ማለት ይቻላል ወዳጅ ነው። ከጀርባ በአማካይ የተዘወረ ነው። በዘመኑ ያሉ የተባሉ ሊቃና ምርጥ የፈጠራ ሰዎች የልብ ባልንጀራም አድርጓል። የፈለገውን ሀገር መሪ ከአውሮፓ እስከ አሜሪካ በአንድ የስልክ ጥሪ ማግኘት የሚችሉ ይባልበታል። በዚህም የተነሳ ዛሬ የአውሮፓ ህብረት የሚባለውን መሰረት ለመጣል የበቁ ዜና በሌሎቹም ስራዎች እውቅና ነገስታትና የሀገር መሪዎች ታላቅ የሜዳሊያ ሽልማት ሊሰጡ ቢፈቅዱም እሱ ግን እምቢተኛ ሆኗል። በዛ ህይወቱን በችግር ድሃውን ቢኖርም ዓለምን የለወጡ ታላላቅ ድርጅቶችን የመሰረተ መሆኑን ይነገርለታል። እነዚህም አንዱና ስም በክፉ የሚያስነሳው ደግሞ ቢልደርበርግ የሚባለው የሚስጥር በምንኩስና በልጅነቱ የተጠራ በስተርጅናው ለሰይጣን የሚሰራ ድርጅት መስርቷል ያስባለው የዘመኑ ሀብት ሳይኖረው እኔም በጉዞ ላይ ነበረና ማንም የት እንዳለ እንኳን አያውቅም ነበረም። ለማን እንደሚሰራም የሚያውቃት ነበረም። ግና ከቫቲካን እስከ ዓለማችን እውቅ የስለላ ድርጅቶች እንዲሁም ሚስጥራዊ ማህበረሰቦች ይሰራል በሚል ስሙ ይነሳል። ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር በክራካው ነው እንደ ጎርጎሮሳውያን የዘመን ቀመር በ1888 የተወለደው። ስለ ልጅነት ህይወቱ ድርሳናት ብዙም አይተርኩም። ግና ቤተሰቡ ከወለዷቸው 5 ልጆች አንዳንድ ድርሳናት 4 ናቸው ይላሉ። የመጨረሻው ተጽፎ ይገኛል። የቤተሰቡ የዘር ግንድ ካይድ መሆኑ እንደ ባልፍ ባገደም ተጽፎም ይገኛል። አባቱ ጆሴፍ ስታኒስላው ሬቲንገር የፖሊሽ ልዑል የሆኑትን ዛሞስኪ የግል የህግ አማካሪ ናቸው። ሬቲንገር የተወለደባት ክራካው ግዛት ገዢ ናቸው ልዑል ዛሞስኪም። ዛሞስኪ የፖሊሽ የመሳፍንት ዘራሽ ሆነው የግዛቲቱ ገዢ ይሁኑ እንጂ በዘመኑ ፖላንድ የምትባል ሀገር በዓለም ካርታ እንደ ሉዓላዊ ግዛት አልነበረችም። በአውስትሮ ሃንጋሪ ስርወ መንግስት ስር ወድቃ ጋሊሺያ የሚባለው ግዛት አካል ነበረችና አባት ጆሴፍ ስታኒስላው ሬቲንገር የልዑል ዛሞይስኪ የህግ ጠበቃ በመሆኑ ይሟገቱ እንደነበርም ይነገራል። ከዚህ አንዱ የአውስትሮ ሃንጋሪ ስርወ መንግስት ከልዑል ዛሞይስኪ ግዛት ዛኮፓኔ የተባለውን ለም መሬት መውሰድን በመቃወም ችሎት ይጠቀሳል። በአውስትሮ ሃንጋሪ የዘውድ ችሎትም ጆሴፍ ስታኒስላው ሬቲንገር ተከራክረው በማሸነፍ ለሙን መሬት ለልዑል ዛሞይስኪ በማስመለሳቸው በፖላንድ ብሔርተኞች ዘንድ እንደ አርበኛ የሚታዩ ናቸው። የሚያባቱ የሙግት አሸናፊነት በሕፃኑ ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ህሊና የፖላንድ ብሔርተኝነትን በጨቅላ ህሊናው በመድረስ ለበስተኋላ ሚናው መሰረት ሆኖታል ይላሉ የታሪክ ጸሐፊዎች። የእናቱ ማርያ ወገን ደግሞ የልሂቃን ቤተሰብ ነው። የእናቱ አባት በግዛት በተሰየሙ ታላቁ የክራካው ዩኒቨርሲቲ ፕሮፌሰር እና ዲን ለመሆን የበቁ ሊቅ ናቸውና አጎቱና አክስቱም እንዲሁ የበቁ የዩኒቨርሲቲው ምሁራን ናቸው። እንዲህ የፖላንድ ብሔርተኝነትን በሚያቀነቅን የተማረና ለመንበር የተጠጋ ቤተሰብ የተወለደው ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ሕይወቱ ገና የ9 ዓመት ልጅ እያለ የሚሉት እውነት ተከሰተ ይላሉ የታሪኩ ጸሐፊ። በአውስትሮ ሃንጋሪ ስርወ መንግስት ሉዓላዊነቷ የጠፋባት የፖሊስ ምድር ገዢ ሉዛሞይስኪ የሕግ የግል አማካሪ የነበሩት አባት ጆሴፍ ስታኒስላው ሬቲንገር መሞታቸው ነው የሕፃኑን የሕይወት መንገድ የቀየረ እውነት የሚባለው። በፖላንድ ብሔርተኞችና በመሪዎችም ዘንድ የግዛቲቱን ምድር በንጉሥ ችሎት ያስመለሱ የክብር ሞገስ ያገኙ ናቸውና በረከቱ ለልጃቸውን መትረፉ አልቀረም። በ9 ዓመት አባቱን ያጣው ሕፃን የማሳደጉን ኃላፊነት የወሰዱት ሉዛሞይስኪ ናቸውና እናም ወጪውን በሙሉ ችለው ወደ ሮም ላኩት ክህነትን በካቶሊክ ገዳማት ይማርና ይከበት ዘንድ። የሆኑ ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር የተቀላቀለው በካቶሊክነት አክራሪ አስተምሮ ይከተላል የሚባለውን የጀስዊት ቀሳውስት ገዳም ነበረ። ይሁንና ከ3 ወራት በላይ በገዳሙ መቆየት አልፈቀደም። በዚህ ምክንያቱ ደግሞ በቅስናው ለመቀጠል እስከ ዕድሜ ልኩ ዳር ሳይመሰረት በድንግልና መኖር ግዴታ መሆኑን ባለመቀበሉ ነው። እና ፈቃዱን ያልተጋቡት ሉዛሞይስኪ ወደ ክራካው አስመጡ። በግዛቲቱ በሚገኝ ምርጥ ትምህርት ቤትም እውቀት ይቀስም ዘንድ ተደረገ። በከፍተኛ ትምህርቱም እንደ ልዑላዊ ቤተሰቡ ሁሉን አሟልተው ወደ ፈረንሳይ ፓሪስ ላኩ። የፈረንሳይ ፓሪስ ከተማም በጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር የእውቀትም የትውውቅም መዲና በመሆን የበዛ ስፍራ ያላት ናት። ሉዛሞይስኪ ልክ እንደ ልጃቸው የተገባውን አሟልተው ነበርና ወደ ፓሪስ የላኩት የተቀላቀለውም የመሳፍንት ልጆች የሚበዙበትን ስብስብ ሆነ። በእውቁና የአውሮፓ ባለጠጋ ልጆች ይማሩበት በሚመረጠው የሶርቦኔ ዩኒቨርሲቲ ያጠና ዘንድም የመረጠው ደግሞ ስነ ጽሑፍ ሆነ። እንደ ሌሎቹ የባለጠጋ ልጆች መከማተል የሚያበዛ ለትምህርቱ ትኩረት የማይሰጥ አልነበረም። እናም ከቀደመው ዘመን ጀምሮም እስከደረሰበት የ20ኛው መቶ ክፍለ ዘመን ድረስ እጅግ ረቂቅ የሚባሉትን የሥነ ጽሑፍ መጽሐፍ አንድም ሳያስቀር ከዳር እስከ ዳር ተወጥቷቸዋል ይላሉ የታሪኩ ጸሐፊዎች። የብዙ ቋንቋዎችን ልክ እንደ አፍ መፍቻ ቋንቋው በጽሑፍም በንባብም ይራቀቅባቸው ስለነበረ ይበልጥ እንደረዳውም ይነገራል። እንዲሁም ሆኖ ከባለጠጎች የመሳፍንት ልጆች የድግሳቸው ታዳሚ መሆኑ አልቀረም። በተለይ በዚህ ግንኙነቱ ከሁሉም የላቀ የመግባባት ተሰጥኦ ኖሮት እንደ ንብ አውራ ሁሉም የሚቀርቡት ነበር ይባልበታል። ከረቂቅ የሙዚቃ ደራሲዎችና ቀማሪዎች እስከ ሰዓሊዎች ድረስ ወዳጆቹ ነበሩ። ደራሲዎች፣ ከያንያንና የተውኔት ሰዎችም እንዲሁ። እነዚህ ደግሞ ከመላው አውሮፓና ከአሜሪካ ጭምር የተሰባሰቡ ናቸው። ከባለጠግነታቸውም የተነሳ በጥቂት ዓመታት ከ5 ሚሊዮን ዶላር በላይ ያጠፉ ጥንድ ጓደኞች እንደነበሩት ለማሳያነት ይጠቀሳል። የበዙቱ ደግሞ ተሻገረው በየሙያቸው ከሀገር አልፈውም በዓለማችን ለመታወቅ የበቁ ናቸው። በዚህ ረገድ ደራሲዎቹ ፍራንኮስ ማሪያክና ጆሴፍ ኮናርድ ይጠቀሳሉ። በተለይ ጆሴፍ ኮናርድ የልብ ባልንጀራው የሚባል ነው። ከባለጠጎቹ የመሳፍንት ልጆች ድግስ ሳይቀር ከመላው ዓለም ከመጡቱ የገዢ ዘሮች ጋር የጠበቀ ግንኙነት እየመሰረተም በትምህርቱም የላቀ ደረጃ ማስመዝገቡ አልቀረም። በዚህ ማሳያ አድርገው የታሪኩ ጸሐፊዎች የሚጠቅሱት ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ሶስተኛ ዲግሪውን ፒኤችዲውን ገና የ20 ዓመት ወጣት እያለ መያዝ ነው። በዚህ ዕድሜ ለዚህ ማዕረግ በመብቃትም ከፈረንሳይ ዩኒቨርሲቲዎችም አልፎ በአውሮፓ ጭምር የእሱ ክብረ ወሰን ለመሆን የበቃ ነው ይላሉ። እንዲያውም እስከ ዛሬ ድረስ ክብረ ወሰኑ አለመሰበሩ ይነገራል። የፈረንሳይ ፓሪስ ሶርቦኔ ዩኒቨርሲቲ ክብረ ወሰን በሆነ ዕድሜም በ20 ዓመቱ ሶስተኛ ዲግሪውን በስነ ጽሑፍ ቢጨርስም ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ግን እውቀት በቃኝ የሚል አለመሆኑ ነው ገራሚውም። ለዚህም ወደ ጀርመን አቅንቶ በሙኒክ ዩኒቨርሲቲ ዘመነኛ ስነልቦና ሳይኮሎጂ ማጥናቱ ይጠቀሳል። ጆሴፍ ሬትዚንገር ስነልቦናን ማጥናት የመረጠው ለምክንያቱ ነው ይላሉ የታሪኩ ጸሐፊዎች። ይህም የሰው ልጅ የሰብዕና የባህሪ መሰረታዊ እውቀቶችን ጠንቅቆ ለማወቅ ካለው ፍላጎት ይመነጫልን ባይ ናቸው። ወደፊት ይዘልቅበት ዘንድ ለሚመኘው የፖለቲካ እንጀራና የመሪነት ደረጃ ሰዎችን ለመዘወር የስነልቦና እውቀቱ እንደሚያስፈልገው ማመኑ ነው ገፊ ምክንያትም ይላሉ። በዚህም የሚዩኒክ ዩኒቨርሲቲ ቆይታው እንደተለመደው ከባለጠጋ ልጆች እየመረጠም ከሊቃኑ ጋር ወዳጅነት መመሰረቱም አልዘነጋውም። ወደ ጣሊያን አቅንቶም በፍሎረንስ እንዲሁ ትምህርቱን ቀጥሎበታል። ወደ እንግሊዝ ለንደንም ጎራ ብሎ ጥናቱን ገፍቶበታል። በእነዚህ ሀገሮች ያጠናው ዘንድ ያተኮረው ደግሞ ምጣኔ ሀብትና ፖለቲካ ሳይንስ ሆነ። በእንግሊዝ ቆይታውም ለውጥ ፈላጊዎች ከሚባለው ቡድን መሪዎች ጋር ተዋወቀም። ቡድኑ የፋቢያን ማህበረሰብ በመባል ይታወቃል። የቡድኑ መሪዎች ደግሞ በስተኋላ በዓለም እውቅ ሊቃን ለመሆን የበቁት ሲድኒ ዌብ፣ ጆርጅ በርናርድ ሾው እና ቢያትሪስ ዌብ ናቸው። ይህ የፋቢያን ማህበረሰብ በማለት የሰየሙት ቡድን በዓለም ላይ ለውጥ ያመጣል የሚሉትን የፖለቲካና የምጣኔ ሀብት አስተሳሰብ እስከ መቅረጽ የደረሰ ነው። ኤልኤስኢ የሚሉት ደግሞ በኮሚኒዝምና በካፒታሊዝም የመንግስት ስርዓት ዘውግ መካከል የሚወድቅ ነው ይላሉ። ለዓለም ሙሉ በሙሉ በመንግስት የሚዘወር የታቀደ ምጣኔ ሀብት እንዲሁም በሌላው ገጽ ገበያ የሚዘውረው የነፃ ኢኮኖሚ የሚባለው አያስፈልግም ባይ ናቸው። ሁለቱንም ያማከለ በመሀል ላይ የሚወድቅ ፖለቲካና ምጣኔ ሀብት ያስፈልጋል የሚል ሀሳብ ያዳበረው የዚህ ቡድን አባል ሆኖም በሁነኛ ተሳታፊነት መዝለቁ የመጪው ዘመኑን ፍላጎት ጭምር ያሳየ ነው ይባልለታል። ጆሴፍ ሬትዚንገር በመላው አውሮፓ መዘዋወር ነበር ቀጣዩ ተልዕኮ ያደረገው። ለዚህም የሚጠቀሰው አንዱ ምክንያት ከካፒታሊዝምና ከኮሚኒዝም ያልሆነ በማለት የፋቢያን ማህበረሰብ የተባለው ቡድን የቀመረውን አስተምህሮ ለማስረጽ የሚል ነው።
ከግማሽ ምዕተ ዓመት በላይ እስካሁን ድረስ የሱ ተጽዕኖ የቴክኖክራት ዘመን
በሌላ በኩልም ከገዢ መሳፍንት ቤተሰቦችና ባለጠጎች ጋር የጠበቀ ወዳጅነት መፍጠር ለሩቅ ሀሳቡን ለሚያስፈልገው በማመን ያደረገው ነው ይላሉ የታሪኩ ጸሐፊዎች። ቦታ ረግቶ መቀመጥ ያለመውደዱ ጉዞን ምርጫ ማድረጉም እዚህ ይጠቀሳል። እናም መላውን አውሮፓ አስሷል። በተለይም እንግሊዝ፣ ፈረንሳይና ጀርመን የቤቱ ያህል የተመላለሰባቸው ናቸው ይላሉ። አልፎ አልፎም ወደ ትውልድ ምድሩ ክራካው ብቅ ማለቱ አልቀረም። በዚህም የመልስ ጉዞው ወራዊ የሆነ መጽሔት ለማሳተም በቅቷል። መጽሔቱም በፖሊሽ ቋንቋ የሚታተም ሲሆን የፖላንድ ብሔርተኝነት ይቀነቀንበት ዘንድ አስቦ ማሳተሙ ይነገራል። እናም የፖላንድ ብሔርተኛ ሊቃን በሙሉ ጽሑፍ የሚለዋወጡበት ከፍም ያለ የጥራት ደረጃ ያለው መጽሔት ነበርም ይላሉ። ጆሴፍ ሬትዚንገር ይመኘው ወደ ነበረው ፖለቲካ ህይወት የገባው የአንደኛው የዓለም ጦርነት ሊቀሰቀስ ጥቂት ዓመታት ሲቀሩት ነው። የመግባቱ ምክንያት ደግሞ የፖሊሽ ፖለቲከኞች ጆሴፍ ሬትዚንገር በለንደን ቢሮ ከፍቶ ለፖላንድ ሉዓላዊ ሀገርነቱ መሆን ይሰራ ዘንድ መምረጣቸው ነው። የሚገርመው የተለያዩ የፖለቲካ ፍላጎት ያላቸው ቡድኖች እሱን ለዚህ ተግባር መምረጣቸው ነው። እንደሚያባቱ የፖላንድ ለም መሬትን የማስመለስ ገድል ለልጁም ተርፎ ይሆናል ይላሉ የታሪኩ ጸሐፊዎች። ከሁሉ በላይ ግን በፖላንድ የተለያዩ ፍላጎት ካላቸው የፖለቲካ ቡድኖች ለአንዱም አባል ያለመሆኑና ገለልተኛነቱ እንዳስመረጠው ግን ብዙዎቹ ይስማማሉ። ግን የፖላንድ ሉዓላዊ ሀገርነት እውን ማድረግ በዘመኑ አስቸጋሪ መሆኑን ሁሉም አላሉትም። ምክንያቱም ፖላንድ የምትባል ሀገር በዓለም ካርታ ላይ አልነበረችምና። በለንደን ቢሮ ከፍቶም ይቻላል የማይባለውን ጆሴፍ ሬትዚንገር መሞከሩ አልቀረም። የወቅቱ የእንግሊዝ ንጉሥ ቀዳማዊ ቻርልስ ድረስ ቀርቦም ለፖላንድ ነጻነት ጆሮ ይሰጡ ዘንድም ደክሟል። ለእንግሊዝ የፖላንድ ሉዓላዊ ሀገርነት እውን መሆን እዚህ ግባ ተብሎ ቁም ነገር የሚሰጠው አልነበረምና የሚሰጠው አልነበረም። ጆሴፍ ሬትዚንገር ግን ቅርም ለዚህ የሚጠቀሰው የአውሮፓ ሶስተኛው የቦይ ስካውቶች በዓል ክብር ነው። የፖሊሽ የቦይ ስካውት አባት ከሚባለው ማልኮስኪ ጋር በመነጋገር ስካውቶቹ ፖላንድ የሚል አርማ ያውለበልቡ ዘንድ አስችሏል። በእርግጥ ልጆቹ የመጡት አገራቸውን ከተቀራመቱ ኦስትሪያ፣ ጀርመንና ሩሲያ ከተያዙ ግዛቶች እነዚህ ሀገሮችን በጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ሴራ መበሳጨታቸው አልቀረም፣ ግን በእጃቸው ሳይገባ ቀረ። አንደኛው የዓለም ጦርነት በተቀሰቀሰ ጊዜ የወሰደው እርምጃ ግን ለሕይወቱ ጭምር የሚያሰጋ ነው። ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር መንግስት የቀረቡ ወዳጆቹን ተጠቅሞ ኦስትሪያ ከጀርመን ህብረት ወጥታ የተናጠል የሰላም ስምምነት እንድትፈራረም ግፊት ማድረግ ነው የዚህ ምክንያቱ። በዚህ መሀልም በኦስትሪያ የተያዘውን የፖላንድ መሬትን ነፃ ለማድረግ ማሰቡ ይነገራል። ይህን የደረሰበት የኦስትሪያ መንግስት በጥብቅ የምፈልገው ነው ብሎ ስሙን ይፋ አደረገ። ጀርመንማ ሞት በሌለበት ፈረደችበት። በለንደን በተሰማ ጊዜ የተከበረው እንግድነት አበቃ ተባለም። እናም ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ወደ ስፔን ለማቅናት ፈረንሳይ ገባ። ግና በኪሱ ቤሳቤስት ያልነበረምና ከችግር ላይ ወደቀ። የደረሰለት ደግሞ የልብ ወዳጁና ደራሲው ሆናል። ገንዘብም ሰጥቶ ለሚያውቃቸው ሰዎች የምስክርነት ደብዳቤን ማስይዞ ወደ ሜክሲኮ ላከው። ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር መቼም ወዳጅ የሚያደርገው በመንበርም በሀብትም ከፍ ያሉትን ነውና ይህንኑ በሜክሲኮ ደገመው። ሲግሪቴ ሞርንሶና ብሩታል ኮካሌስ ከበዙ ወዳጆቹ ይጠቀሳሉ። በስተኋላ ብሩታል ኮካሌስ የሜክሲኮ ፕሬዚዳንት፣ ሞረንስ ደግሞ የንግድና ኢንዱስትሪ ሚኒስቴር ለመሆን የበቁ ናቸው። በእርግጥ እነዚህ ሰዎች ለስልጣን እንዲበቁ የገዛውን የሴራ ጨዋታ የከወነው ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ነው ይላሉ የታሪኩ ጸሐፊዎች። ለስልጣን ከበቁም በኋላ በሜክሲኮ የሚገኙ የነዳጅ ማውጫዎችን በሙሉ መንግስት እንዲወርስ ያማከረው እሱ ነው ይላሉ። አለፋችሁ ከመንበር ጀርባ የነበረ መሪ ነበር ባይ ናቸው።
በሜክሲኮ በነበረ ጊዜ የፕሬዚዳንት የፖለቲካ
ይህ የነዳጅ ማውጫዎችን የሜክሲኮ መንግስት የመውረስ ውሳኔ ግን አሜሪካንን አላስደሰተም። ምክንያቱም የሀገሯ ኩባንያዎች ነበሩና የነዳጅ ጉድጓዶቹ ባለቤቶች። እናም አዲሱ የሜክሲኮ መንግስት በአሜሪካ ጥርስ ውስጥ ገባም። ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገርም የአሜሪካ ሕዝብ ጠላት ተባለም። አሜሪካ የጠመደችውን ሳታስወግድ እንቅልፍ አይወስዳትም እና አዲሱ መንግስት ከአንድ 10 ዓመታት ብዙም ያላለፈ ሆነ የስልጣን ዘመኑ ከዋሽንግተን በተቀነባበረ መፈንቅለ መንግስት ከስልጣን ተገለም። መሪዎቹ ዕጣ ፈንታቸው ስደት ለመሆን በቃ። አሜሪካ የህዝብ ጠላት በሚል የሚፈለገው ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገርም በእጃቸው ሳይገባ መጥቶ ወደ አውሮፓ ቀና። ወደ አውሮፓ ከተመለሰ በኋላ ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር መቀመጫውን ለንደን ያድርግ እንጂ በመላው አገሪቱ የሚዘዋወር ነበር ይሉታል። በእርግጥ 2 ሚስቶችን አግብቶ ልጆች የወለደው በዚህ ዘመን መሆኑ ተጽፏል። የሁለተኛው የዓለም ጦርነት እስኪጀመር ድረስ ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር እረፍት የለሽ ተጓዥ ሆኖ አውሮፓን ማካለሉን ይተርካሉ የታሪኩ ጸሐፊዎች። እንዲያውም በስተኋላ እውን ያደረጋቸውን ሀሳቦች ለአውሮፓ ገዢዎችና ባለጠጎች የሰበከውም በዚህ ዘመን ነው ባይ ናቸው። ይህም አንድ የዓለም መንግስት የሚል ሀሳብ ነው። የሚገርመው ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር መቼ የት ሀገር እንደሚጓዝና እንደተጓዘ ማንም እርግጡን መናገር ያለመቻሉ ነው። ከነማን ጋር እንደተገናኘም እንዲሁም ሁሉ ጉዞ ለማድረግ የእሱ ሀብት እንደማያስችለው ቢታወቅም ገንዘቡንም ከማንና ከየት እንዳመጣውም ያለመታወቅ የአውሮፓን ከዩናይትድ ስቴትስ አሜሪካ ጋር በማስተባበር ይፈጠር የሚለውን አንድ የዓለም መንግስት ሀሳብ በዚህ ዘመን በብርቱ ሰጥቶበታል። በሌላው ተቃርኖ ገጽታም የዘሬ አንዘርዝረኝ እንደሚባለው በሀገራችን ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር የአይሁዳዊቱ ሀገር እስራኤል መፈጠርን የሚደግፍና የሰራበትን ዘመን ነው። ወቅቱ በአውሮፓ የጽዮናዊነት እንቅስቃሴ መሪ ከነበሩት ከነ ቻይም ዊዝማንና ናኦም ሳክሎቭ ጋር ተባብሮ መስራቱ እዚህ ይጠቀሳል። የሁለተኛው የዓለም ጦርነት መቀስቀስ ግን ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ወደ ቀደመው የፖላንድ ሉዓላዊ ሀገርነት እንቅስቃሴ መለሰው። በወቅቱ የፖላንድ የስደተኛው መንግስት የሚባለው መሪ ጄኔራል ሲኮርስኪ የስደተኛው ካቢኔ መሪና የለንደን ተወካያቸው እንዲሆን መምረጣቸው ነው። ለዚህ ምክንያቱ
እሱ የኤርትራን ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር የነበሩት ጀነራል ሲኮርስኪ የቅርብ ወዳጅ ነበር። ጀነራሉ በስደት የነበረው መንግስታቸው የፖለቲካ አማካሪ እንደሆነ አጅተውታል።
ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገርም ጀነራል ሲኮርስኪን በአዲሱ አስተምሮ አጠመቃቸው ይላሉ የታሪኩ ጸሐፊዎች። ከጀርባም መዘወሩን የለመደበት ነውና በራሳቸው አንደበት የሲኮርስኪ እቅድ የተባለውን ይናገሩ ዘንድ ገፋቸው። ፖላንድ ሉዓላዊ ሀገር ሆና ብቅ ብትልም ብቻዋን መኖር አይቻላትምና እናም ከሌሎች እንደ ኦስትሪያ፣ ጀርመንና ሩሲያ ካሉት ሀገሮች በፌዴሬሽን የምትተዳደር ሀገር ትሆናለች። ይህም ከምስራቅ አውሮፓም አልፎ መላው አውሮፓ የሚያካትት ሆኖ የአውሮፓ ህብረት ይፈጠር የሚለውን የእሱን አስተምሮም ጀነራሉ ለዓለም ይፈጠራሉ። ከዚህም ባለፈ በለንደን የአውሮፓ ሀገሮች ተወካዮችን በሚስጥር በመሰብሰብ በሀሳቡ ላይ መወያየትና ወደ ሰነድነት መቀየር ጀመሩ። የዚህ ዋነኛው ዘዋሪ ደግሞ ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ነበርና የአውሮፓ ህብረት ሀሳብ አመንጭና ጀማሪ የሚባለው። እንዲያውም ምስጢራዊ ኮሚቴ ተቋቁሞ ስራው የተጀመረው በዚህ ዘመን መሆኑ ይነገራል። ይሁንና የጀነራል ሲኮርስኪ መሞት የህይወት አቅጣጫ ቀያሪ ሆነም። ጀነራሉ በመካከለኛው ምስራቅ ያደራጁትን ሰራዊት ጦርነት እንዲጀምር አዘው ወደ ለንደን ሲመለሱ ነበር በጂብራልተር ላይ አይሮፕላናቸው የጋየው። ተልእኮው ወታደራዊ ነበረና ከካቢኔያቸው አብሮ ያልሄደው ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ብቻ ነበረ ከሹሞቻቸው የተረፈው። አውሮፕላኑ የጋየበት መንስኤ ምስጢራዊነት ደግሞ ይበልጥ ተስፋ አስቆራጭ ነበር የሆነበት ለሱ። ከጀነራል ሲኮርስኪ ሞት በኋላም ለፖላንድ ነጻ ሀገርነት መስራቱን አላቋረጠም። በእርግጥ በጀነራሉ እግር ከተተኩት የፖላንድ የስደተኛው መንግስት መሪ ጋር ብዙም ባይባባም ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር በተለይ በዚህ ጊዜም ፖላንድ ነጻ ሀገር መሆኗ የማይቀር ቢሆንም ከምስራቅ ከሚመጣው የሶቪየት ህብረት ሶሻሊስት ርዕዮት እንዳትጠመቅ ቀድሞ በመመልከት ይወተውት ነበረም። እናም በለንደን የቢሮ ስራ መወሰኑን ትቶን በሐሰት የእንግሊዝ ሻምበል ስምና የወታደር የደንብ ልብስ በፖላንድ ለትጥቅ ትግል ከሚያደርጉ ተዋጊዎች ጋር ዘመተን። በዚህ ዘመን ነው በ58 ዓመቱ በጦርነት ስፍራ በጃንጥላ ወይም ፓራሹት በመዝለል እስከ ዛሬም በስሙ የተያዘ ክብረ ወሰን ያስመዘግበው። በፖላንድ ምድር ግን እንደጠበቀው ተልእኮውን መወጣት አልተቻለውም። ያስጠልሉት ዘንድ የተመደቡት ሰዎች ለጠላት ያደሩ ነበሩና መርዝ ሰጡት። መርዝ ሰጪዋ ሴትዮ መጠኑን በማሳሳቷም ለጥቂት ከሞት ተረፈች እንጂ የዛኑ ያህል ደጋፊዎች ነበሩትና በህቡ የማምለጫ መንገድ ለለንደን በቃ። ብዙ የታተረበት ህይወቱን ጭምር ለአደጋ ያጋለጠበት የፖላንድ ነጻ ሀገር መሆን ሀሳቡን እርግፍ አድርጎተውም። ለዚህ ምክንያቱ ደግሞ ፖላንድ እንደፈራው የሶሻሊስት ርዕዮት ተጠምቃ ከሶቪየት ህብረት ጥላ መጠጋቷ ነው። በዚህም የተነሳ ለጥቂት ዓመታት ትቶት ወደ ነበረው የቀድሞው የአንድ የዓለም መንግስት ሀሳቡ ተመለሰም። በዚህ ጥርጊያ ደግሞ የሚሆነው በቅድሚያ የአውሮፓ ህብረት መሆኑን አላጣውም። እናም የአውሮፓ አህጉር የሚል ዲስኩር አዘጋጅቶም በመላው ሀገሮች እየዞረ መስበክ ጀመረም። ከለንደን እስከ ሮም የሁሉም ሀገሮች የመንበር ገዢዎችና ባለጠጎችን በስብሰባም በግልም እያገኘ ሀሳቡን መስበክ መደበኛ ስራ ሆነ። የቫቲካኑ የበስተኋላ ጳጳስ ጳውሎስ ስድስተኛ ገና ካርዲናል ሞንቴኔ እያሉ በአውሮፓ አንድነት ሀሳቡ ያጠመቃቸው በዚህ ዘመን ነው። አፉ ላይ ለሰከንድ የማይጠፋውን ሲጋራ እየማገም ከመኪና ወደ ባቡር ከዛም ወደ አውሮፕላን እየተጋባም በአውሮፓ ሀሳቡን ረጨው። እንደ ቀደመው ሁሉ ወጪውን ማን እንደሚሸፍንና በእርግጥ መቼና የት እንደነበረ ከነማን ጋር እንደተገናኘ ታሪኩን አጠናን የሚሉት እንኳን ያለማወቃቸው ነው ገራሚው ተረክ። ግን አልፋቱ ሰምሮ እንደ ጎርጎሮሳውያኑ አቆጣጠር በ1948 በሄግ የደች ፓርላማ የፓን አውሮፓ ጉባኤን በሊቀመንበርነት እውን አደረገም። የአውሮፓ ዓለም አቀፍ እንቅስቃሴ ተብሎ የተመሰረተውንና አህጉሪቱን አንድ የሚያደርገውን ስራ ይወጣ ዘንድ ኃላፊነት ያለበት ተቋም የመጀመሪያው ጸሐፊ ለመሆኑም በቃም። ለዚህ ተግባሩ ከ5 በላይ ሀገሮች የክብር ሽልማት ሊሰጡት ቢያስቡም እሱ ግን ፈቃደኛ አልነበረም። እንግሊዝ እንዲያውም የሀገሪቱን ታላቅ ሜዳሊያ ልትሰጠው ስነ ስርዓት አዘጋጅታ ነበረም። በስነ ስርዓቱ ላይ ሳይገኝ በእንቢታ አልተቀበለም እንጂ።
በከፍተኛ ስልጣን ላይ ያሉ ሰዎች ጋር ያለው ግንኙነት እጅግ እሱ ለአሜሪካ ፕሬዚዳንት ስልክ ወዲያው ቀጠሮ መያዝ ይችላል። በአውሮፓ በየትኛው
የአውሮፓ የምጣኔ ሀብት ትብብር ሊግ የሚባለውን ከሌሎች ጋር በመመስረት አውራው ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር የመሆኑን ሀቅ ዛሬም በክብር አህጉሪቱ አንድ ሆና ታነሳዋለች። ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ግን በዚህ የአውሮፓ አንድ መሆን የተነሳበት የዓለም አንድ መንግስት ሀሳብ መገደብ እንደሌለበት ቀድሞም አላጣውም። እናም አሜሪካንን ከአውሮፓ ጋር የሚያጣምር ህብረት መፍጠር አለብኝ አለም። በዚህም ነው ስሙን እስከ ዛሬ በክፉ የሚያስነሳውን የቢልደርበርግ ምስጢራዊ ማህበረሰብን የመሰረተው። ከአውሮፓና ከአሜሪካ በፖለቲካም ሆነ በምጣኔ ሀብት ከዛም አልፎ በድንቅነት እጅግ ተጽዕኖ ፈጣሪ ታላላቅ ሰዎችን በኔዘርላንድስ ቢልደርበርግ ሆቴል በመሰብሰቡ ነው ቡድኑ ስሙን የወረሰው። ስብሰባውን የመራው ራሱ ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ሲሆን የቡድኑም የመጀመሪያ ጸሐፊ ሆኖ ተመረጠም። ይህ ቢልደርበርግ ምስጢራዊ ማህበረሰብ የመጀመሪያው ስብሰባ አጀንዳም ሆነም የተሳተፉ ሰዎች ማንነት እስከ ዛሬ ሚስጥር ነው። በየዓመቱ እጅግ በከፍተኛ ጥበቃና ሚስጥር ስብሰባው እንደቀጠለ ቢሆንም የአሜሪካና የአውሮፓ የፖለቲካ መሪዎች እንዲሁም የዓለማችን ባለጠጎች ይሳተፉበታል ቢባልም አሁንም የቢልደርበርግ ቡድን ምስጢራዊ ማህበረሰብ ወይም ሴክሬት ሶሳይቲ ነው። ይህ ማህበረሰብ ዓለምን ከጀርባ የሚዘውር መሆኑ ይነገርለታል። ያሻውን ሰው ከመንበር ላይ ማስቀመጥም ሆነም ማውረድ ቀላል ነው። የፈለገውን ሀገር አፍርሶ መልሶ መገንባትም እንዲሁ ይባልለታል። በፈለገው ሰዓት ያለምን ምጣኔ ለኪሳራ መዳረግ እንዲሁም አትራፊ ማድረግ ለቢልደርበርግ ምስጢራዊ ማህበረሰብ እጅግ ቀላሉ ነው። ከሁሉ በላይ ግን የጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ስም ከቡድኑ መመስረት ጋር በመያያዝ በክፉ የሚነሳው የቢልደርበርግ ምስጢራዊ ማህበረሰብ የሰይጣኖች አለቃ ሉሲፈር አምልኮም ተከታይ ነው በሚል ነው። ሰው ከመገበርም ጀምሮ የቡድኑ አባላት ለዚህ አምልኮ የከፋ ኃጢአት ይፈጽማሉ ይባላል። አንድ የዓለም መንግስት አንድ ሃይማኖት በሚልም እየሰራ የሉሲፈር መንግስት ባለሚመጣ ዘንድም ይተጋል ይባልለታል። የምስጢራዊ ማህበረሰብ አባላትም አሜሪካ እስከ አውሮፓም ከእስያ እስከ አፍሪካ ብቻ ምን አለፋችሁም በመላው ዓለም በፖለቲካው ስልጣን እጅግ የገነኑ የሀገር መሪዎች የዓለማችን ሀብትን የጠቀለሉ ባለጠጎች በመሆናቸው ያሻቸውን እያደረጉ ነው ይባልላቸዋል። የቢልደርበርግ ምስጢራዊ ማህበረሰብ ከተመሰረተ በኋላም ለ6 ዓመታት በጸሐፊነት ከመራ በኋላ በ72 ዓመቱ በሳምባ ምች ጆሴፍ ሬቲንገር ቢሞትም ስሙ በክፉ የሚነሳው ለዚህ ነው። በልጅነቱ ለምንኩስና ተጠርቶ በስተርጅናው ለሰይጣን ገበረ ነው የትችቱ ያመክኖ ትንታኔ። ቸር ያሰንብተን።
C'est toujours mélangé toutes les années depuis le commencement que nous faisons ces conférences. Nous avons toujours des sujets politiques et économiques. Ça, c'est un peu mélangé, mais en général, on a un sujet politique, un sujet économique. Très très bien de votre part. Mais nous avons fait une règle depuis le commencement. La règle, c'est que de ne pas inviter les membres de la presse qui font leur métier, ni des interviews pendant ou après la conférence, ni de donner les documents, mais nous invitons comme participants toujours membres de la presse qui, avec l'idée que tout ce qu'ils entendent et ils participent toujours avec leur idée et leur discussion, ils peuvent usager ça comme ce qu'on appelle en anglais background information pour les articles qui vont écrire. Il y a aussi des rédacteurs en chef, il y a des directeurs des radios quelquefois de tous les pays. Combien de membres de la presse et radio, télévision, etc. nous avons cette fois? It's good for them, but not for us. Oui, mais parce que vous savez, l'année prochaine, ça pourrait être le Figaro. Il y a eu des raisons d'un point de vue d'un autre pays, d'un autre participant qu'avant. Et ça, c'est la chose principale. On se connaît après, pendant les repas et après le dîner, on parle ensemble. Alors il y a une espèce d'ambiance qui aide beaucoup pour très souvent comme résultat effectif que entre 2 ou 3 pays que les malentendus qui ont existé ont été éliminés. On a dit ah maintenant on comprend pourquoi on a dit ou fait telle et telle chose. Bon, si c'est comme ça, alors on n'est plus fâché. Et ça c'est déjà très bon Mais on ne fait jamais de résolution, aucune, jamais de recommandation. On parle sur le sujet, voilà, et les participants peuvent alors, c'est recommandé à eux de parler dans leur cercle, dans leur pays, sur tout ce qu'ils ont entendu et tout ce qu'ils pensent avoir appris des autres. Peut-être dire, oui, mais il n'y a pas de membres. Et à chaque année, il y a quelques-uns qui sont plus ou moins réguliers. Là, et dépendant sur le sujet que nous avons chaque année, les amis de chaque pays disent il faut inviter monsieur tel et tel ou madame tel et tel, parce que ce sont des spécialistes sur le problème que nous avons discuté. L'année dernière, c'était sans savoir, nous étions des petits prophètes, on dit la possible crise d'énergie dans le mois de mai. Et la crise d'énergie est venue beaucoup plus vite que tout le monde des participants ont pensé, parce que les participants là-bas ont plus ou moins pensé qu'une crise d'énergie pourrait se développer dans l'année 75-76. Mais personne n'avait pensé que ça pourrait se développer en 73. Mais ça, c'était le thème. Et aussi, les mêmes choses sur lesquelles on discute aujourd'hui dans le monde, une possible collaboration entre les pays producteurs et les pays qui ont besoin des matériaux primaires.
Qui sont les sujets qui gênent le plus de l'Europe, de l'Ouest et des États-Unis, du Canada. Qui gênent peuvent gêner dans le futur. Il y a des moments quand le sujet, c'est des années qu'on a discuté surtout des relations avec le tiers-monde. Parce que ça nous apparaît en ce temps-là, il y a une dizaine d'années, de plus important. Donc pour retourner à ce sujet, un de ces années,
nous avons aussi discuté il y a quelques années la question du futur des universités et de l'éducation générale dans le monde libre. Des choses sont tout à fait différentes du sujet cette année. Ça dépend.
Un peu prophète en ce temps-là, on a discuté la question des universités juste avant les événements de mai 60.
Oui, ça c'est vrai. Ouais. Et il n'y a pas une parfaitement raison de faire cela. Bon, là si on comprend ça, on peut s'adapter un tout petit peu pour avoir un compromis. Peut-être, je ne sais pas. Mais nous n'avons jamais entendu aucun de nos trois une chose positive de ce point. Oui. Alors on peut s'interroger. Oui, on pourrait, mais
comparé avec. Vous connaissez le bon mot à New York de deux avocats américains qui se rencontrent et un dit how's your wife et l'autre dit compared to what. Et je crois que quand on parle d'efficacité des réunions internationales, il faut comparer avec les autres réunions internationales.
Je pourrais peut-être le dire de la façon suivante. Le fait que les participants différents viennent encore chaque année avec plaisir nous montre que nous faisons quelque chose de bien. Sinon, on n'aurait pas les participants, des gens importants qui veulent venir ici n'importe où pour 3 jours pour discuter les uns avec les autres. Alors, ça, c'est pour nous un peu le... 山脈なかった。あったの高槻山でした。さあ、した。さあ、遅いししてますよ。さあ、しゃあないって。いいですね、本当に。この通り。台湾はなぜ呼ばれてるの？さあ、人らしきわけ。な、ほら、いいっすよ。他にも日本、無関係、ほんとけ。安い方だよ。さあ、ありがとうね。この通り。ここで私はさあ、お前でかいですね、本当に。ご覧なさい。ね、ありがとうございますね。世界の人間は報道関係者としたあまり撮影怒られるってな、ちょっと気にしてあげるね。さあ、どうしても報道したがって。さあね、今回はサングラスね。さあ、the greatest threat to the current economic recovery is that we must misunderstand what is the basis of it all. And I believe that the basis of it all is our lack of understanding, and especially the lack of understanding of the informed elite about the interdependencies in our economy and the basic components of economic growth and sometimes economic crisis.
I want to follow in George Lucas's great tradition. You know, I think about what we do, and I think about who's the chairperson of everything that I do, and that's my wife. And so I'm going to let her speak, but I just want to say one thing. Thank you very much, the Carnegie Endowment. Thank you very much for the incredible support that you give Bartan and your whole staff to so many organizations, so many deserving people. One of the things that we so much enjoy is being able to help others. And it doesn't matter whether it's in the arts, whether it's in education, sciences, healthcare, and just seeing people thrive from what we're able to do. And one thing I learned many years ago, and I heard it from another great philanthropist, David Rockefeller, in which I asked him, what should I do? I'm a young person, I'd like to get involved with some organizations. He said, whatever you do, don't just write a check, but get involved and get personally involved. And that, to both Marie-José and to me, has been the greatest pleasure that we've had, giving our time, giving our effort, and then seeing the results. So I'm going to turn it over to the chairman.
Thank you so much. What can I add? I have to say that we're both honored and humbled to be here. And I say humbled because looking at the achievements of Andrew Carnegie, who presciently and with great generosity really invested in the future of this country. And you look at the 22 institutions that he created and recipients who have invested also in this country's future, who have done it with such dedication and commitment, and who have lived by the adage of William Shakespeare, who said that the meaning of life is to find your gift, but the purpose of life is to give it away. And bravo to all of you for giving it so generously. Henry mentioned the areas in which we focus our attention. We focus our attention on the biosciences, trying to accelerate the rate of discovery, bringing bench to bed more quickly to improve the quality of patient care and health outcomes. We focus on education, notably helping less fortunate but highly motivated students to get through high school, to excel in high school, but also to get through college, so that they can both strive and thrive in their adult years. And finally, we try to devote a great deal of our attention to the arts and culture. The arts and culture that afford us a new way of looking, a new way of thinking, that expand the landscape of the mind and that improve quality of life. And I'm very thankful to all of you and to the Carnegie Corporation, and especially to Vartan Gregorian, who's encouraged us and inspired us in directing our giving and in growing our philanthropic involvement. But I would be remiss if I didn't also thank the people to whom Judy alluded to earlier in her remarks, the millions and millions of Americans who every day give, not only financially, but give of their time, who volunteer to make their communities better. We hear a great deal about hate and intolerance these days, but every day, millions and millions of Americans, all through the nation, are living and upholding the definition of philanthropy, the love of humanity, and I thank them profoundly.
Standing here at the center of our nation's power, I can think only of everyone who's been made to feel powerless by their abusers, by a system that failed to protect them. Parents whose children have been murdered by an abusive partner, women who suffered domestic violence yet are not believed, children who've suffered life-altering trauma and post-traumatic stress at the hands of people closest to them. That's why passing this law is one of the most important votes U.S. senators will cast this year. The ugly truth is that violence in homes is normalized in our country. Try to stay calm when you're witnessing someone you love being harmed. Try to stay calm if after you were strangled and you find the courage to come forward, you discover that your chances of proving the abuse are now gone because no one took into account the different ways bruising presents on black and brown skin, and they failed to check properly for signs of injury. I am in awe of the parents who, after the murder of their children, have fought to change the law to protect the next one. And most of all, I want to acknowledge the children who are terrified and suffering at this moment, and the many people for whom this legislation comes too late. The women who have suffered through this system with little or no support, who still carry the pain and trauma of their abuse. The young adults who have survived abuse and emerged stronger, not because of the child protective system, but despite it. And the women and children who have died, who could have been saved.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.
してるんじゃないか。こちら日本版のどっかで俺の三井ビルにですね、AI 超遠い後ろを見てくれ。いやすごいですよ。
まあ元が俺ですしたらもう立ち去ることに乗ってまさかこういうこと俺は立ち去る見たとこないけどだね。納得や。俺がしたジャニーさんを救った。
Liberal democracy can survive the current period of disruption, but it's going to have to change. The volatility and the risks that we are witnessing across much of the Western world are anchored in some very deep changes that have been swirling beneath our democracies, that have been coming for many years and still have a long way to run. They relate to strong feelings of distrust in the political system, widespread fears over the perceived destruction of ways of life, national identity, big worries over deprivation, the way in which the economic settlement is playing out, and weakening bonds between the mainstream parties and ordinary voters. Those four currents have been with us for a very long time, before the Great Recession, before the arrival of Facebook and Twitter and big tech, but they are now producing very substantive political effects, and they will continue to produce substantive political effects. So liberal democracy has to change. It has to make its political systems more representative. It has to ensure that people feel that their nations and communities are secure and have strong and robust external borders. And it also, over the long term, needs to devise an economic settlement that ensures that everybody feels that they are relatively getting the gains and the benefits that other groups in society are getting as well. Very big challenges, no clear answer as to now. The ball is very much in liberal democracy's court.
Oh.
これで1時間経ってさ。
So bringing trilateral to Slovenia means also bringing Slovenia to trilateral. And as you know, David Rockefeller Fellows had a pre-program. It is our pleasure that we connected them at the MCHEM breakfast with Slovenian Business Society. They were talking about the global issues and how connected the world is, with some local representatives and even some members of Trilateral. It is also our pleasure that the former Prime Minister, who is the current Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Miro Cerar, had the time to meet with them and discuss where the Europe is today and where the Europe is going.
And of course, we have finished our program with amazing lunch with Professor Dana Zohar.
No, liberal democracy will not survive in an unchanged form. It has not been changing enough to accommodate the vast, speedy development of the internet and of the communication technologies. And it has been changing too much, given the rather static nature of men.
And it's very hard to predict how to will end up. Parliamentary drama, a drama inside the Conservative Party, and a drama in the country at large. I do not think it is certain that the British will leave the European Union.
思い出した。あれはあれ本当。
Protectionism is never a good solution for trade, because in the long run it will endanger the competitiveness of everyone. The European car industry, whether you talk about OEMs or whether you talk about such suppliers, is very competitive, is export oriented, is very successful on world markets, but most of the companies are not only delivering cars to other parts of the world, they are also producing cars in those parts of the world, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in China, whether it's Southeast Asia, where they have a lot of success. That means in the long run, free trade is always the best solution for economy and for the countries which want to safeguard jobs and prosperity.
井上や邪魔したの。
Quantum leader is a new paradigm leader who realizes that the world is holistic. All things, all people, all problems are interconnected. There are no others. There is no separation. I am you, you are me. Thus, a quantum leader would say the problem of inequality very differently, or the problem of identity very differently, because we are not separate, atomistic, isolated individuals, and our problems are not separate, isolated, and atomistic. A quantum leader is ethical, is moral, has compassion. A quantum leader is self-aware. A quantum leader celebrates diversity. A quantum leader asks fundamental questions, always questioning him or herself, questioning assumptions, questioning the way things have been done, questioning the norm.
おかしいと思ったら無理しまいます。おかしいと思ってん。おかしい。邪魔してたんか。あれはね。死が全土に圧力かけたんだけど。黙らせた。
He exists to serve others and to serve the world. Indeed, to serve the universe.
さあ、もうパスポートね、何世になってんよ。そう。 なっちまったよ。
Well, there's no simple answer to the issue of
確認したけど、
asymmetric attacks on democracy.
もしかしたら
Point being that
多分
you
や
can
っぱ
disrupt elections in
こっそり
a
取ったから
democratic elections in a democratic country is rather
も
difficult
っと
to
危
do
険
in
覚えたら多
more
分
authoritarian regimes if they really don't have genuine elections.
もうとか
What are you going to do when you are attacked? I think we need a broad range of responses, beginning with looking at
こ
our
れ初
electoral
日
systems to ensure that they are proportional, so you don't have the kind of issues you had in the U.S. presidential elections, where because of the electoral college system, some states have far more weight. I think we need to look at the kind of electoral systems we have and make sure that we get a broad representation rather than a simple binary decision of a first past the post election system. We need to think about our asymmetric advantages. We have rule of law. That's pretty important.
びっくりした国立会に制しちゃった
It's interesting. The authoritarian regimes all place their money abroad in places where there is rule of law.
おかしいと思った
In an authoritarian regime, you can just lose everything all at once. Someone takes your money. Whereas if it's in the West, or a rule of law country, then that's unlikely. Well, maybe we can make it more difficult to keep your money here. Or we can be much more we definitely should be much more transparent about ownership. After all, much of the money laundering that we've seen from the authoritarian states that are attacking us goes through anonymous shell companies. These are again issues that need to be taken up by government authorities in order ultimately to defend democracy. Well, there's no simple answer to the issue of asymmetric attacks on democracies. The point being that you can disrupt elections in a democratic elections in a democratic country. It's rather difficult to do it with an authoritarian regime since they really don't have genuine elections. And so what are you going to do when you are attacked? I think we need a broad range of responses, beginning with looking at our electoral systems to ensure that they are proportional, so you don't have the kind of issues you had in the U.S. presidential elections, where because of the electoral college system, some states had far more weight. I think we need to look at the kind of electoral systems we have and make sure that we get a broad representation rather than a simple binary decision of a first past the post election system. We need to think about our asymmetric advantages. We have rule of law. That's very important. It's interesting. The authoritarian regimes all place their money abroad in places where there is rule of law. Why? Because in an authoritarian regime, you can just lose everything all at once. Someone takes your money. Whereas if it's in the West, or rather in a rule of law country, then that's unlikely. Well, maybe we can make it more difficult to keep your money here. Or we can be much more definitely should be much more transparent about ownership. After all, much of the money laundering that we've seen from the authoritarian states that are attacking us goes through anonymous shell companies. These are again issues that need to be taken up by government authorities in order ultimately to defend democracy.
Silicon Valley provides a unique ecosystem, basically in some sense a network of having a very strong university that's very applied that is all about working with the real world, doing basic research, and then trying to put that basic research into the society, into the good. An important thing, I think, is also that it's a social network of sharing. Is that basically in California there is no non-competes, so people move around freely, and this means that the flow of innovation is much faster. The other important thing is the size, the critical mass, again, of very large amounts of talent, so that companies can be scaled up very quickly. For example, in my own experience, I started working with Pinterest when there was less than 200 of us. 3 years later, there is a few thousand of us. And the company culture and everything wasn't lost, and the new people got hired. And then I think the last thing is that universities, as well as kind of companies, focus less on protecting their IP and really trying to move as fast as possible. Because if we think about innovation is about moving fast, and it's not so much about building walls and figuring out how to do the next step very carefully. It's really about running and iterating fast. And if we run and iterate fast, then the success will be there, and kind of little details don't matter that much. And I think this is important from the viewpoint of university, letting the research be put in the public domain and really benefit the environments in which the university's professors operate, as well as in terms of companies sharing the information and flow of people with each other. So there is, for example, in Silicon Valley, a lot of different seminars, people from one company visiting the other company, sharing quite openly actually what they are doing, writing academic papers, again talking about the latest solutions, so that we are all up to date, and the entire system can kind of help each other in terms of making the most innovation and the most progress in the short amount of time. Because I think the question is not can we innovate, but the question is, or can we invent something, but the question about innovation is, can we be the first ones to do something? So it's as much about the speed as it is about the substance.
パスポートセンターないんやそれがに
We had a really good discussion today. Reviving the European dream is what we really want. The next year will be the election for the European Union, for the Parliament of the European Union. And it is really important that there will be a strong mandate. One of the challenges we are facing at the moment is still the migration crisis. And also the priority of the Austrian presidency is security and the fight against illegal migration. So we had a good discussion today on all these topics. And of course, there are different opinions on this. But in general, we are always on the same line. We want to have a solution for the European Union and for Europe. Safe external borders and legal migration, because Europe will need it in the end. But people still have in front of their eyes the migration flood in 2015, and therefore it is really important to have a good solution, and a solution which will be implemented in all the countries of the European Union to have a resilient European asylum system.
それ映るわけだからねやっぱりな昔遠すぎるって絶対2020年に完成予定だったのに
Migration is currently one of the key issues of European citizens, and my view is that it will remain so, especially because migration is here to stay, and it will probably increase in numbers and complexity because of the political consequences of wars, the terrorism, but also because of the climate change. I think, in my view, migration is needed in Europe. I think it's something that we can benefit from, and I think that we need to change the narrative on this. First and foremost, us as politicians. Actually, the demographic of Europe says that migration is something that we will need in the future in order to maintain and grow our economic development and quality of life. And I think that we should also go back to the European shared values and the human values that are, I think, the foundation stone of Europe, so that together we can change, as I said, the narrative and help these people, but also help ourselves grow and develop further. Thank you.
さあ、本当に大体挙になった。本物だったよね。まだ、無視してくれていったんだね。で、そこに日本って書いてあるの。普通、ジャパンって書くのにな。何世になったってことだ。無視してくれて。
Cooperation and membership of Turkey to the EU. In these three scenarios, of course, there are different outcomes. But I would say that confrontation between Turkey and the EU is a complete lose-lose scenario. And if it is only cooperation instead of membership of Turkey to the EU, this will be some sort of limited cooperation, and it will be a scenario in which both Turkey and the EU will not be able to enjoy the full potential. In economics, we say, this is not cost effective at all. But when it comes to EU membership, I would say that this will mean full use of potential of Turkey and the EU together. This means a stronger, stable, respected, fully democratic Turkey, but this also means in the world scene a global actor of EU, peace-bringing EU, welfare-creating EU, employment-creating EU. So I would say that in this case, membership case, the outcome would be win-win-win. So win for Turkey, win for the EU, but also win for beyond.
パスポート本物ね。ただ、住所は無視していいってなった。そういうことな。無視していい。そういうこと。
You will have to define what you mean by Europe and the European Union having its own army. I do not think Europe needs its own army for what I would qualify as the classical Article 5 NATO scenario. In other words, in a conflict with Russia. But Europe should definitely, the European Union should definitely develop the possibility to project hard power without the United States of America. I can imagine a scenario in Northern Africa where you have a combination of terrorism, climate change, migration. It's an ungoverned part of Africa, largely. Where Boko Haram meets al-Qaeda, where al-Qaeda meets Daesh. In other words, it's not impossible. Look at the French and what they did and are doing in Mali, that you would need to intervene militarily, and then the European Union would be on its own. The second scenario, virtual but not impossible, when in the Balkans the demons of the past would raise again. And we should not repeat the situation like we had in the 90s of the previous century, where finally Bill Clinton and the United States of America had to come in to stabilize the situation. I could think about the need for border protection, external border protection, with military means. You're a bit on the border here between the military and the military police, the gendarmerie in French. In other words, if that is meant by President